You know how sometimes you hear a story so wild, so unbelievable, that you just have to question whether it could even be real. That moment when you pause, tilt your head, and wonder, how on earth could that actually happen? Well, when it comes to crime in America, the truth isn't just stranger than fiction. It often feels like it's playing by an entirely different set of rules. Think about it. We've all grown up with crime dramas, detective novels, and blockbuster films that have trained us to expect certain patterns. The meticulous heist, the calculated revenge, the clues that slowly fall into place. But what if I told you that some of the most jaw-dropping criminal cases in U.S. history are so bizarre, so utterly outlandish, that they make Hollywood's wildest scripts look tame by comparison? These are stories that defy logic, challenge our understanding of human behavior, and blur the line between absurdity and reality. Today, we're embarking on a journey through 32 of the most unbelievable criminal cases America has ever seen. Tales so peculiar and mind-boggling that you might find yourself questioning everything you thought you knew about crime. These aren't your typical whodunits or straightforward scandals. These are deeply weird, often darkly humorous, and always unforgettable episodes that showcase just how creative and downright strange human beings can be when they step outside the law. From heists pulled off with almost comical incompetence to cons so elaborate they feel like something from a surreal dream, each story is a reminder that reality doesn't always follow a neat, predictable script. In fact, it often revels in the chaotic, the unexpected, and the utterly inexplicable. So settle in, because what you're about to hear isn't just a list of crimes. It's a window into a side of American history that's equal parts fascinating, unsettling, and darkly entertaining. These are stories that have confounded law enforcement, captivated the public, and left a lasting mark on the cultural landscape precisely because they sound too bizarre to be true. And yet, every single one of them happened. As we dive into these 32 unbelievable tales, prepare to be amazed, maybe even a little unnerved, and certainly left wondering, how could anyone ever make this stuff up? Our first story takes us back to October 15, 2009, a day that began with a truly surreal sight captivating millions of viewers across the nation. Live on television, a silver, saucer-shaped object, a homemade helium balloon cobbled together from mylar and plywood, drifted helplessly across the Colorado sky. Inside, authorities and a horrified public believed was a 6-year-old boy named Falcon Heen. His parents, Richard and Mayumi, had frantically called 911, reporting that their son had accidentally climbed into the craft they had built in their backyard and that the tethers had snapped, sending him on a potentially deadly journey. What followed was a massive, multi-agency response. The National Guard scrambled 2 helicopters, Denver International Airport was forced to ground and reroute flights, and police chased the balloon across 60 miles of countryside, all while news networks broke into regular programming to broadcast the bizarre chase. The entire country held its breath, hoping for a miracle for the little boy they called Balloon Boy. But that miracle was never needed because the entire terrifying ordeal was a complete fabrication. Later that evening, after the balloon had landed empty and the world sighed in collective confusion, young Falcon Heen, during a live television interview, accidentally revealed the truth. When asked by a news anchor why he hadn't come out of his hiding place during the hours-long search of his family's home, the boy innocently replied, "You guys said that we did this for the show." The jig was up. Investigators quickly pieced together that Richard and Mayumi Heen, aspiring reality television personalities, had orchestrated the entire event as a desperate publicity stunt. They had hidden their son in the attic the entire time, instructing him to remain silent. Their goal was to generate so much media attention that networks would finally give them the reality show they so desperately craved. The fallout was swift and severe. The public's sympathy rapidly turned to outrage. The Heens were charged with conspiracy and filing a false police report, a costly crime that wasted an enormous amount of law enforcement resources and put first responders in genuine danger. Both parents eventually pleaded guilty. Richard was sentenced to 90 days in jail and ordered to pay $36,000 in restitution, while Mayumi received a sentence of 20 days. The Balloon Boy hoax stands as a perfect, if deeply cynical, example of the lengths to which people will go for a taste of fame, crafting a story so bizarre and emotionally manipulative that the entire world was, for a few hours, completely fooled. While the Balloon Boy hoax was a modern-day spectacle of manufactured drama, our next story takes us back a century to a disaster born not from a hunger for fame, but from corporate greed and staggering incompetence, with consequences that were tragically and horrifyingly real. It was January 15, 1919, in Boston's bustling North End. At around 12:30 in the afternoon, the streets were filled with the usual lunchtime activity. But in an instant, the ordinary sounds of the city were shattered by a deep, thunderous rumble that witnesses described as sounding like 1,000 machine guns firing at once. What followed was a nightmare no one could have ever imagined. A 15-meter or 25-foot wave of dark, viscous liquid moving at an estimated 55 kilometers or 35 miles per hour tearing through the neighborhood. This wasn't water, it was molasses. An enormous storage tank owned by the Purity Distilling Company had catastrophically failed, unleashing approximately 8.7 million liters or 2.3 million gallons of the sticky syrup. The force of the wave was immense. It swept buildings off their foundations, crushed freight cars on the adjacent railway, and even lifted a truck right into the harbor. The molasses, though often thought of as a slow-moving substance, was anything but. Its initial wave moved with the speed and destructive power of a tsunami, and as it slowed, it created a deadly, suffocating quagmire. People, horses, and debris were trapped in a thick, sticky ooze that was over a meter or several feet deep in places. The more victims struggled, the more entrapped they became. The scene was one of utter chaos and desperation, with residents and rescue workers wading through the syrup in a frantic effort to save those who were drowning. In the end, 21 people lost their lives and 150 were injured, making it one of the most bizarre and deadly industrial accidents in American history. In the aftermath, a landmark legal battle began that would set a new precedent for corporate accountability. The tank, which had been built hastily and shoddily to meet the demand for industrial alcohol during World War I, had been a known hazard. Residents reported that it groaned and shuddered ominously, and it often leaked so much that local children would bring sticks to collect the free molasses dripping from its seams. The United States Industrial Alcohol Company, the parent company of Purity Distilling, blamed anarchists for a bomb, trying to capitalize on the post-war Red Scare. But a pioneering civil investigation, one of the first to extensively use expert testimony from engineers and metallurgists, proved otherwise. The evidence was clear. The tank's steel walls were too thin, the rivets were faulty, and the company had neglected basic safety tests, even failing to fill the tank with water first to check for leaks because they were in such a rush to get the molasses in. The court found the company entirely negligent, and they were forced to pay out what would be millions in today's dollars in settlements. This tragedy directly led to stricter regulations for industrial construction and engineering standards across the state of Massachusetts and the entire country. For decades afterwards, on hot summer days, residents of the North End claimed they could still smell molasses wafting up from the very bricks of their neighborhood. A ghostly, sweet, and somber reminder of the day, a sugary substance became an instrument of death and a powerful catalyst for change. From the tragic and almost surreal disaster of the Great Molasses Flood, we jump forward to a crime that feels like it was ripped from the most twisted pages of a Hollywood thriller, yet it was all too real. On the afternoon of August 28, 2003, in Erie, Pennsylvania, a 55-year-old pizza deliveryman named Brian Wells walked into a PNC bank. He wasn't there to make a deposit. Clutched in his hand was a crude, pistol-shaped device that looked like a prop from a low-budget film, and locked around his neck was what appeared to be a heavy metal collar. He handed a note to the teller that laid out a series of bizarre and terrifying demands. The note claimed he was a victim, that the collar was a live bomb, and that he had to rob the bank to get the keys to remove it. He was given a specific amount of time to complete the robbery and then follow a series of instructions from a detailed scavenger hunt list he carried with him. Wells managed to get $250,000, left the bank, and was quickly apprehended by police in a nearby parking lot just minutes later. As officers surrounded him, unsure if the device was real, Wells sat on the pavement, pleading with them that he was an innocent pawn in a deadly game. He told them he had been forced into this by several people at a TV tower site where he had delivered a pizza. Tragically, his pleas were cut short. Before the bomb squad could even arrive, the device locked around his neck detonated with a powerful blast, killing Brian Wells instantly in a horrifying public spectacle. The initial investigation seemed to point to a lone, desperate man who had built a bomb and tried to rob a bank, a tragic and failed criminal act. But the sheer strangeness of the scavenger hunt list, the intricate design of the collar bomb, and Wells's own insistence that he was a victim quickly led authorities to believe the story was far more complex. This wasn't a simple robbery, it was an elaborate and sadistic plot. The investigation eventually uncovered a bizarre love triangle and a convoluted scheme masterminded by two individuals, Marjorie Deal Armstrong, a highly intelligent but deeply troubled woman with a history of mental illness and a prior conviction for killing her boyfriend, and her accomplice, Kenneth Barnes. The plot, as investigators painstakingly pieced together, was shockingly cold-blooded. Deal Armstrong allegedly wanted her father dead to inherit his money and had enlisted Barnes for the hit. They needed funds to pay for it, and so they devised this insane plan to force someone to rob a bank for them. The true cruelty of their scheme was in its design. They never intended for Brian Wells to survive. The scavenger hunt he was sent on was a wild goose chase with impossible time limits, designed purely to ensure the bomb would detonate in a public place, killing him and, they hoped, destroying any evidence that could lead back to them. They had lured Wells to a remote location under the guise of a pizza delivery order where they overwhelmed him, locked the bomb onto his neck, and sent him on his fatal mission. For years, the case remained officially unsolved, a dark and puzzling mystery. It wasn't until 2007 that federal prosecutors finally charged Deal Armstrong and Barnes with conspiracy, bank robbery, and the murder of Brian Wells. Kenneth Barnes pleaded guilty and testified against Deal Armstrong, who was ultimately found guilty and sentenced to life in prison, though she died of cancer in 2017. The case of the collar bomb heist remains one of the most chilling and psychologically complex crimes in modern memory, a stark reminder that the human capacity for manipulation and cruelty can sometimes be more explosive than any device. Moving from the chilling, murderous plot of the collar bomb heist, our next story offers a bizarre and almost comedic contrast, proving that not all monumental crimes are carried out with sinister genius. Sometimes they are executed with a level of sheer audacity and outright stupidity that is almost charming in its absurdity. This is the tale of the Loomis Fargo heist, a crime that was less about meticulous planning and more about grabbing an almost unimaginable amount of cash and hoping for the best. In the early hours of October 4, 1997, David Scott Gant, a supervisor at the Loomis Fargo vault in Charlotte, North Carolina, did something that would have been unthinkable to most people. He didn't just skim a little off the top or sneak out a few bundles. He and an accomplice, Kelly Campbell, who was also a former Loomis employee, loaded over $17 million in cash into a company van and simply drove away. This wasn't a sophisticated operation involving cutting-edge technology or intricate blueprints. Gant, who was trusted with the alarm codes and had intimate knowledge of the vault's security, essentially used his key, disabled the alarms, and spent hours loading 50-pound bags of money into the back of a truck. The sheer volume of cash was so immense that it was one of the largest cash robberies in United States history at the time, surpassed only by famous heists like the 1972 United Airlines hijacking by D.B. Cooper. But here's where the story shifts from a bold crime to a farcical comedy of errors. The mastermind behind the entire operation wasn't actually Gant or Campbell. It was a man named Steve Chambers and his wife, Michelle. Gant, who was infatuated with Campbell, was essentially the inside man who did the heavy lifting. His reward was to be a small cut of the money and a plan to flee to Mexico while the Chamberses coordinated moving and hiding the massive haul. The plan, however, immediately began to unravel due to one critical flaw. The perpetrators had absolutely no concept of how to launder $17 million or lie discreetly. Instead of laying low, Steve and Michelle Chambers embarked on a spending spree so extravagant and blatant that it might as well have been a neon sign pointing directly at their front door. Almost overnight, the Chamberses transformed from a middle-class couple into ridiculously flashy millionaires. They bought a $635,000 home in a gated community, paying in cash, of course, and then immediately spent another $160,000 on renovations, including a new swimming pool. They purchased a fleet of new cars, including a $50,000 black Corvette and a $42,000 Rolex for Steve. Michelle got breast augmentation surgery. They threw lavish parties, tipped waitresses with $100 bills, and even bought a $90,000 black stretch limousine. They were essentially living out a rap video fantasy in a quiet North Carolina suburb, and it didn't take long for their neighbors and eventually the authorities to notice that something was very, very wrong. The investigation was practically handed to the police. A local private investigator, who was a neighbor in their new upscale community, became suspicious of the sudden, unexplained wealth and began his own informal inquiry, quickly passing his findings to the FBI. The paper trail was a mile wide. The Chamberses had made no effort to hide their new fortune. Meanwhile, down in Mexico, David Gant was feeling isolated, lonely, and increasingly paranoid. He made the fatal mistake of repeatedly calling his co-conspirators in the States, and the FBI was listening in on every single conversation. Within just 5 months of the heist, the entire ring was in custody. Investigators found millions of dollars buried in coolers in the backyard of another accomplice and stuffed in storage units. In the end, the sheer incompetence of the criminals was their ultimate downfall. They were so overwhelmed by their sudden wealth that they couldn't help but show it off, making them some of the easiest major felons for the FBI to catch. The Loomis Fargo heist remains a classic cautionary tale, a story where the crime itself was almost impressive in its simplicity, but the aftermath was a spectacular display of greed, arrogance, and downright foolishness. If the Loomis Fargo gang's downfall was their inability to resist flaunting their ill-gotten gains, our next case presents the polar opposite. A criminal so cool, so composed, and so utterly mysterious that he managed to pull off an incredible feat and then simply vanish into thin air, leaving behind one of the greatest unsolved mysteries in American history. This is the legend of D.B. Cooper. It all began on the day before Thanksgiving, November 24, 1971. A man who identified himself as Dan Cooper purchased a one-way ticket for Northwest Orient Airlines Flight 305 from Portland, Oregon to Seattle, Washington. He was described as being in his mid-40s, wearing a black raincoat, a dark suit, a thin black tie, and white patent leather shoes. He was calm, polite, and almost businesslike as he took his seat in the rear of the Boeing 727. Once the plane was airborne, he handed a note to a flight attendant named Florence Schaffner. Assuming it was a phone number, she initially slipped it into her pocket without reading it, but Cooper leaned in and whispered, "Miss, you'd better look at that note. I have a bomb." The note was direct and astonishing. It demanded $200,000 in negotiable American currency, all in $20 bills, and 4 parachutes, 2 back parachutes and 2 front parachutes. He insisted they be delivered to him upon landing in Seattle, where he would release the 36 passengers in exchange for the money and equipment. If anyone tried anything, he would detonate the explosive device he carried in his briefcase. The crew alerted authorities on the ground, and while the plane circled Puget Sound, the FBI scrambled to assemble the ransom packet. They gathered 10,000 beautifully crisp $20 bills, each one meticulously photographed and their serial numbers recorded. They also provided the 4 parachutes he requested, which included both functional and emergency models. After landing in Seattle, the exchange went exactly as Cooper had dictated. The passengers were released, the fuel truck refilled the plane, and the money and parachutes were brought on board. Cooper then instructed the crew, the pilot, co-pilot, flight engineer, and 1 flight attendant, to take off again. His new orders were to fly to Mexico City, but at a very specific altitude and speed, no higher than 10,000 feet, with the landing gear down, the flaps set at 15 degrees, and the cabin deliberately left unpressurized. Most crucially, he demanded that the rear air stair, a feature unique to the Boeing 727, remain lowered and open during the flight. This was the key to his entire audacious plan. Somewhere over the dense, rain-soaked wilderness of southern Washington state, in the pitch black of a stormy night, Dan Cooper did the unthinkable. He tied the bag of money to his body, attached one of the parachutes, and without a trace of hesitation, he leaped down those rear stairs and into the howling wind, disappearing into the darkness below. The crew, who had been instructed to remain in the cockpit with the door closed, had no idea he was even gone until they landed in Reno for a scheduled fuel stop. Dan Cooper and the $200,000 were gone. What followed was one of the largest and most intensive manhunts in FBI history. Agents scoured the suspected drop zone, military planes crisscrossed the area, and local law enforcement followed up on thousands of tips. They found nothing, not a single trace of the man himself. It wasn't until 8 years later, in 1980, that a young boy named Brian Ingram, on a family picnic along the Columbia River, unearthed a rotting package buried in the sand. It contained 294 of the $20 bills from the ransom, their serial numbers a perfect match. The discovery of this small portion of the cash only deepened the mystery. How did it get there? Had Cooper survived the jump and buried it? Did it wash downstream from his landing spot? Or was it all that remained of a doomed parachutist who never made it out of the woods? The FBI pursued countless leads over the decades, investigating hundreds of potential suspects, from disgruntled aerospace employees and former paratroopers to con artists, and even a man who died shortly after the hijacking, leaving a note that read, "I know nothing of a D. B. Cooper." The name D.B. Cooper itself is a historical mistake stemming from an early news report that misidentified a potential suspect. The hijacker only ever used the name Dan Cooper. But the legend of D.B. Cooper had already been born. He became an anti-establishment folk hero, a symbol of a lone individual outsmarting the system and getting away with it. The case was officially closed by the FBI in 2016, after 45 years of investigation, having exhausted all viable leads. To this day, no one knows who he was, where he landed, or if he even survived that daring jump. He remains a ghost, a master of timing and audacity who executed a perfect crime and then vanished into the cold Pacific Northwest rain, leaving behind nothing but a stack of photographed bills and an enduring American myth. The sheer complexity of the plot that led to Brian Wells's death was only matched by the deeply disturbed minds that conceived it. While Wells was the pawn forced onto the board, the true players were a pair of individuals whose lives were a tangled web of mental illness, manipulation, and violence. At the center was Marjorie Deal Armstrong, a woman whose intelligence was tragically overshadowed by a profound instability. Before she ever concocted the collar bomb scheme, Deal Armstrong's life was already a catalogue of chaos. She had been tried and acquitted for the shooting death of her live-in boyfriend, Robert Thomas, in 1984, claiming self-defense. Then, in 1988, she was investigated but never charged in the death of another boyfriend, James Roden, who was found shot in the head in a freezer. It was this second death that would later become directly entangled with the bomb plot, as investigators believed Kenneth Barnes, her accomplice, helped her move Roden's body. Deal Armstrong's partner in the scheme was Kenneth Barnes, a chronically unemployed and heavy drinking man who was infatuated with her. Their relationship was a toxic feedback loop of desperation and delusion. The official motive, as laid out by prosecutors, was shockingly straightforward: money. Deal Armstrong wanted her wealthy father dead so she could collect a $250,000 inheritance, and she had enlisted Barnes to carry out the murder for a fee of $30,000. The bank robbery was simply their method of raising the hitman's payment, but the plan they devised to get that money revealed a level of psychological cruelty that goes far beyond a simple financial motive. This was not just a robbery, it was an elaborate, sadistic game with a predetermined loser. The infamous scavenger hunt list given to Brian Wells was not a genuine set of instructions for survival. It was a carefully crafted ruse, a dark joke designed to ensure his death. The list directed him to various locations to place what he was told were additional explosives, a task with impossible time limits. The masterminds knew the bomb would detonate long before he could ever complete the circuit. They never intended for him to get the combination to the lock or to survive the ordeal. His death was a necessary part of the plan to eliminate the only witness who could directly link them to the crime. The entire performance, from the delivery order that lured him to the tower site to the specific demands at the bank, was orchestrated to make Wells look like a willing participant who had simply lost control of his own plot. Deal Armstrong and Barnes watched the events unfold on television, just like the rest of the horrified nation, confident that their pawn would be silenced forever and that they would remain in the shadows. What they underestimated was the persistence of the investigators, who saw through the absurdity of the lone bomber theory and painstakingly unraveled the threads of their twisted friendship, uncovering a story of manipulation and cold-blooded calculation that was far stranger than any fiction. While the legend of D.B. Cooper is defined by a mysterious figure who escaped all consequences, our next story is a stark and infuriating look at a modern case where the consequences for a horrific crime seem to vanish into thin air, not because of a clever escape, but because of a controversial and unprecedented legal defense. This is the notorious case of Ethan Couch, the so-called affluenza teen. On the night of June 15, 2013, in Burleson, Texas, 16-year-old Ethan Couch made a series of catastrophic decisions. He and a group of friends had stolen 2 cases of beer from a local Walmart. Later, crammed into his father's Ford F-350 pickup truck, Couch, who was far too young to have a license, got behind the wheel. With 7 passengers in the truck, he proceeded to drive at a staggering speed, with blood alcohol level later measured at .24, 3 times the legal limit for an adult in Texas. He was also found to have traces of Valium in his system. As he sped down a dark rural road at 70 miles per hour in a 40 zone, he never saw the group of people ahead of him. They were standing on the side of the road, trying to help a woman whose SUV had stalled. In an instant, Ethan Couch plowed into them. The collision was devastating. 4 people were killed instantly: Brina Mitchell, whose car had broken down, Holly Boyles and her daughter Shelby, who had come out from their nearby home to help, and Brian Jennings, a youth pastor who had also stopped to offer assistance. 2 of Couch's own passengers were ejected from the truck bed and suffered severe, life-altering injuries. One is now unable to move or talk due to a traumatic brain injury. The facts of the case were horrifyingly straightforward. A severely intoxicated teen driver caused a fatal wreck. In the Texas justice system, which is known for its tough stance on crime, particularly drunk driving, a severe punishment was widely expected. Couch was charged with 4 counts of intoxication manslaughter and 2 counts of intoxication assault. He faced the possibility of 20 years in a state prison. But during the trial, his defense team introduced a psychological concept that would shock the nation and become the defining element of the case. A defense psychologist, Dr. G. Dick Miller, testified that Ethan Couch was a product of affluenza. He argued that the teenager's immensely wealthy parents had never set boundaries for him, had never allowed him to experience consequences for his actions, and had essentially crippled his ability to understand the link between his behavior and its outcomes. The term affluenza, while occasionally used in sociological discussions, was not a recognized medical or psychological diagnosis. Dr. Miller claimed that Couch's privilege was so profound that it had created a disability, making him less culpable for the deaths he had caused. In a decision that sparked immediate and furious outrage, State District Judge Gene Boyd agreed with this defense. Instead of the decades in prison that prosecutors sought, Judge Boyd sentenced Couch in December 2013 to 10 years of probation and ordered him to undergo therapy at a long-term, inpatient rehab facility for which his wealthy family would pay. The message sent by the verdict was explosive. A white, privileged teenager could kill 4 people, shatter multiple families, and essentially receive no jail time because his parents were too rich and too permissive. The public reacted with a firestorm of criticism, decrying the ruling as a textbook example of a 2-tiered justice system where wealth could literally buy a get-out-of-jail-free card. The families of the victims were left hollow and angry, with one family member stating that the sentence implied their loved ones' lives only worth probation. For a time, it seemed Ethan Couch had indeed avoided any real punishment. He was sent to a posh California rehab center that reportedly featured equine therapy and yoga. But the story was far from over. The conditions of his probation were strict, including a ban on drinking alcohol and driving. In late 2015, a video emerged on social media that appeared to show Couch at a party playing beer pong. This potential violation triggered a manhunt when he and his mother, Tonya Couch, failed to appear for a meeting with his probation officer. The two had instead fled to Mexico, where they were eventually apprehended in the resort city of Puerto Vallarta, living a life of leisure. Their attempt to escape justice only cemented the public's perception of a family that believed the rules did not apply to them. Ethan Couch was eventually extradited back to Texas, and this time the legal system showed far less leniency. In April 2016, a judge sentenced him to 720 days, nearly 2 years, in jail for violating the terms of his probation. He was released in April 2018 for good behavior, but remained under supervised release until 2020. The affluenza teen case became a cultural flashpoint, a disturbing story that forced a national conversation about privilege, accountability, and whether the American justice system truly is blind, or if it sometimes looks very differently upon those with immense wealth and influence. While the case of Ethan Couch explored the bizarre intersection of crime and privilege, our next story serves as a potent reminder that not all criminal masterminds are blessed with an overabundance of intelligence. In fact, some are so spectacularly lacking in basic cunning that their crimes become case studies in how not to break the law. This brings us to the unforgettable tale of Mark Geraldfo, a man who executed a bank heist with all the subtlety and foresight of a toddler attempting to hide a stolen cookie. The scene was a Capital One bank branch in the Bay Ridge neighborhood of Brooklyn, New York, on a seemingly ordinary day in November 2015. A man later identified as Mark Geraldfo approached the teller's window. He didn't brandish a weapon or make a scene. Instead, he went with the classic note-passing technique, a move straight out of Amateur Robber 101. The note was direct and to the point, informing the teller that he had a bomb and demanding cash. It was a terrifying threat, one that would understandably make any bank employee comply out of fear for their life and the lives of everyone in the building. The teller, following protocol, handed over the money, $1,000 in cash. Gerald Foe took it, turned around, and walked right out the front door, apparently getting away with his small-time crime. For a few brief moments, Mark Gerald Foe was a successful bank robber, but his success was about to be incredibly short-lived. You see, Mark Gerald Foe had made one critical, almost unbelievable error in planning his caper. He hadn't brought a pre-written note. He hadn't scribbled his demands on a random piece of scrap paper. In a move of staggering incompetence, he had written the threatening message on the back of his own personal bank deposit slip. This wasn't just any piece of paper, it was a document that was, by its very design, filled with his personal identifying information. There, in clear print, was his full name, Mark Gerald Foe. Right below that was his home address. He had literally handed the bank teller a signed confession with his return address on it. It would be like a burglar dropping their driver's license on the living room floor on their way out. Unsurprisingly, the police did not have to launch a complex, multi-state manhunt. They did not need to assemble a team of forensic accountants or profile the criminal's mind. They simply took the deposit slip as evidence, got into their squad car, and drove to the address listed on the note. They found Mark Gerald Foe at home, and they arrested him without incident. The $1,000 was recovered. He was charged with robbery and making a terrorist threat, all because he failed to grasp the most fundamental rule of crime: don't leave a signed receipt for your felony. The story of the Gerald Foe heist quickly became a viral sensation, not for its daring or its danger, but for its sheer, unadulterated stupidity. It was a story that provided a moment of levity in the often dark world of true crime, a perfect example of a would-be criminal who was his own worst enemy. It's a tale that makes you wonder what exactly was going through his mind. Was it a moment of panic? A bizarre assumption that the teller would be too flustered to look at both sides of the slip? Or was it simply a stunning lack of foresight? Whatever the reason, Mark Gerald Foe secured his place in the annals of criminal history not as a master thief, but as a cautionary punchline, proving that sometimes the greatest obstacle to a life of crime isn't the police, it's a profound lack of common sense. If the case of Mark Gerald Foe represents one end of the criminal competence spectrum, our next story catapults us to the opposite extreme, chronicling the unbelievable 2-year saga of a teenager whose audacious cross-country crime spree felt less like a series of felonies and more like a surreal, real-life adventure movie. This is the legend of Colton Harris Moore, the Barefoot Bandit. His story begins not with a dramatic heist, but in a trailer on Camano Island, a small, wooded community in Washington state. From a young age, Colton's life was difficult. His father was an alcoholic, his home life was unstable, and he frequently ran away, finding solace not in people, but in the wilderness and technology. He started with small-time burglaries, breaking into homes to steal food and money, but he quickly graduated to a much more ambitious form of theft. He wasn't just stealing things, he was teaching himself how to operate complex machinery using manuals and information he found online. By the age of 17, Colton Harris Moore wasn't just a troubled kid, he was a self-taught pilot, sailor, and getaway driver, all rolled into one. His crime spree exploded into the national spotlight in 2008 after he escaped from a halfway house. What followed was a breathtaking run of burglaries and vehicle thefts across the Pacific Northwest, but it was his unique signature that captured the public's imagination. He often committed his crimes barefoot. He would leave chalk outlines of his feet at crime scenes, a calling card that was both bizarre and brilliant, cementing a folk hero persona. He wasn't just stealing, he was performing. He primarily targeted the wealthy vacation homes on the islands of the Puget Sound, but he wasn't after lavish goods. He stole cash, food, high-end electronics, and most astonishingly, the keys to airplanes tied down at small, rural airports. With no formal training whatsoever, Colton Harris Moore taught himself to fly by studying flight manuals and using video games like Microsoft Flight Simulator. He then put that knowledge to the test in the most terrifying way possible, successfully stealing and flying several small aircraft, sometimes crash landing them in fields after running out of fuel. His escapades grew ever more daring. After a particularly close call with law enforcement in the San Juan Islands, he didn't just lay low. He stole a plane in Idaho and flew it over 600 miles, crash landing it in a field in Washington. Another time, he stole a boat in British Columbia and navigated it all the way to the San Juan Islands. He stole cars for ground transportation, all while managing to evade one of the largest manhunts in the region's history. The FBI, local sheriffs, and state police were all on his trail, but he seemed to be always one step ahead, using his intimate knowledge of the woods and his incredible ability to bypass security systems. The public's reaction was deeply divided. To the victims whose homes and property he violated, he was a criminal who caused fear and significant financial loss. But to a growing number of people watching from afar, he was a modern-day Huck Finn, a symbol of rebellious youth and ingenuity sticking it to the system. This cult following exploded on the internet, with Facebook fan pages springing up with tens of thousands of members. People bought "Run, Colton, Run" T-shirts. His story was no longer just a local crime blotter item. It was a national media sensation. The legend, however, was about to meet reality. After a 2-year spree that stretched from Washington state to the Midwest and finally to the East Coast, his luck ran out in the Bahamas in July 2010. After allegedly stealing a plane in Indiana and flying it over 1,000 miles, he crash-landed it in the Bahamas, where he was finally captured after a high-speed boat chase. The 19-year-old who had evaded capture for so long was cornered, and in a moment that perfectly encapsulated his entire spree, he was reportedly shot in the leg after trying to flee by jumping out of a hotel window. Colton Harris Moore pleaded guilty to dozens of federal charges in 2011 and was sentenced to 6.5 years in prison. In a surprising twist, he expressed a desire to turn his life around, stating that he was, quote, "humbled and thankful for this opportunity to make a fresh start." The judge in the case even allowed him to keep the rights to his own life story, hoping the proceeds could be used to pay back the $1.3 million in restitution he owed his victims. Since his release from prison, he has reportedly been working in a legitimate job and has kept a low profile. The saga of the Barefoot Bandit remains one of the most peculiar crime stories of the 21st century, a tale that blurs the line between villain and anti-hero, and a stark reminder of how a combination of high intelligence, profound desperation, and a thirst for adventure can sometimes spiral into a legend that nobody could have ever scripted. From the romanticized, adventure-fueled escapades of the Barefoot Bandit, we now descend into a story of pure, calculated darkness, a case that shattered the illusion of safety in the digital age and revealed a monster hiding behind the promising facade of a future healer. This is the horrifying tale of Philip Markoff, the man the media dubbed the Craigslist killer. In the spring of 2009, the city of Boston was gripped by fear. A predator was using one of the internet's most popular platforms, Craigslist, to target women offering erotic services. The pattern was chillingly consistent. He would contact them using a burner phone to arrange a meeting at an upscale hotel. He presented himself as a polite, professional client, often using the alias Andy. But he wasn't there for the service he booked. He was there to rob them at gunpoint. His first known attack occurred on April 10th at the Westin Copley Place Hotel, where he tied up a 29-year-old woman from Las Vegas and stole $800 in cash and her credit cards before fleeing. He struck again just 3 days later at the same hotel, binding and robbing another woman. The crimes were violent and terrifying, but the women survived. That terrifying pattern was shattered just over a week later, on April 14th, when his actions turned murderous. He arranged to meet a 26-year-old woman named Julissa Brisman at the Marriott Copley Place. Brisman was an aspiring model and actress from New York City in Boston to promote a line of jewelry. Like the others, she had advertised massage services on Craigslist. When hotel staff entered her room the next morning, they found a scene of utter horror. Julissa Brisman had been shot 3 times and brutally assaulted. She was pronounced dead at the scene. The investigation, which had already been intense, was now a full-blown homicide manhunt. The pressure on the Boston Police Department was immense. They had a sophisticated killer who left behind very few clues, operating in the heart of the city and exploiting the anonymous nature of online classifieds. The break in the case came from a combination of modern technology and old-fashioned police work. Investigators painstakingly tracked the electronic footprint of the killer. They followed the trail of the emails used to contact the victims, which led back to an anonymous account, and the calls made from the disposable cell phone. Crucially, they were able to link purchases made with the stolen credit cards from the first robbery to surveillance footage at various locations. One of these purchases was for a parking spot at a Rhode Island casino. The footage from the casino's parking garage was the key. It showed a handsome, clean-cut young man with a distinct, purposeful walk. He looked like any other college student. But he was their prime suspect. The man in the video was 23-year-old Philip Markoff, a second-year medical student at Boston University School of Medicine. To everyone who knew him, the image was incomprehensible. Markoff was the all-American boy. He was engaged to be married to a fellow student, a woman described as bright and beautiful, and they lived together in an off-campus apartment. He was a member of a prestigious medical fraternity, played lacrosse in high school, and was by all accounts a brilliant and dedicated student on the path to becoming a surgeon. He presented a flawless, charming exterior. His fiancée and family were utterly blindsided, describing him as a perfect gentleman who was caring and destined for greatness. This was the terrifying core of the case, the stark, impossible duality of his life. By day, he was a promising future doctor studying anatomy and saving lives. By night, he was a cold, calculated predator, binding and robbing women and ultimately taking a life. Authorities moved quickly once they had identified him. They tracked his cell phone and found he was driving south on Interstate 95 toward Foxwoods Casino in Connecticut, a pattern that matched his previous movements after the attacks. A tactical team surrounded his car during a scheduled rest stop and took him into custody without incident. In his vehicle, police found a black semi-automatic handgun, the same caliber used to kill Julissa Brisman, hidden behind a panel in the car's interior, along with plastic cable ties, tape, and women's jewelry. It was all the evidence they needed. He was charged with armed robbery, kidnapping, and the murder of Julissa Brisman. The story became a national media sensation, a perfect storm of true crime intrigue. A handsome medical student, a sordid secret life, the use of a ubiquitous website, and the tragic death of a young woman with big dreams. The term Craigslist killer was splashed across every headline, though it was a label Craigslist itself vehemently objected to, pointing out that the platform was merely the tool, not the cause. While sitting in jail awaiting trial, Markoff maintained his innocence. But any chance for a public trial and answers for the victims' families vanished on August 15, 2009, just over 3 months after his arrest. Guards at the Suffolk County Jail found him dead in his cell. He had used a makeshift instrument to sever major arteries in his neck and legs and had also suffocated himself with a plastic bag. He left behind a note for his fiancée and family professing his love. In death, as in life, Philip Markoff remained an enigma, a man who chose to end his own story rather than account for his horrifying actions, leaving behind a chilling legacy about the monsters who can hide in plain sight. armed with nothing more than a polite email and a deadly double life. The digital age has given us incredible tools for connection and creativity, but it has also opened a portal to darker corners of the human experience, blurring the lines between fantasy and reality in ways we are still struggling to understand. This terrifying ambiguity was at the heart of a case that shocked the world in 2014, a story that began not in a shadowy alleyway, but in the seemingly safe suburban landscape of Waukesha, Wisconsin, and involved a monster that everyone knew wasn't real until, for two young girls, he became terrifyingly real. This is the disturbing tale of the Slender Man Stabbing. It started with an online myth. Slender Man was a fictional supernatural character born from an internet meme on a website called Something Awful in 2009. He was depicted as an unnaturally tall, thin figure in a black suit, with a blank, featureless face and tentacle-like arms, who stalked and abducted children, often appearing in forests or near schools. The character took on a life of his own through thousands of user-generated stories, photoshopped images, and viral horror series on YouTube like Marble Hornets. For most teenagers and young adults who encountered him, Slender Man was a thrilling piece of modern folklore, a campfire story for the digital era. But for two 12-year-old best friends, Morgan Geyser and Anissa Weier, the myth became an inescapable and commanding reality. Over months, the girls became deeply immersed in the online world of Slender Man. They consumed every piece of content they could find, and their shared fascination evolved into a shared delusion. They began to genuinely believe that Slender Man was real, that he lived in a mansion in the Nicolet National Forest, and that he had a group of proxies, human followers who carried out his command. Most crucially, they became convinced that he was threatening them and their families. They believed that to become his proxies themselves, to save their families from his wrath, they had to prove their loyalty by committing the ultimate act, murder. Their chosen victim was another 12-year-old girl, their friend and classmate Peyton Leutner, whom they lured into the woods for a game of hide and seek after a sleepover. On the morning of May 31, 2014, in a secluded patch of forest, the game turned into a nightmare. As Peyton sat on a log, Anissa Weier allegedly urged Morgan Geyser on, telling her, "Go ballistic, go crazy." Morgan then proceeded to stab Peyton Leutner 19 times with a 5-inch kitchen knife, the blows piercing her major organs and narrowly missing her heart. The attack was vicious and methodical. When they believed their task was complete, they left Peyton bleeding and dying in the woods and began their own journey, with the plan to walk the 60 miles to the Nicolet National Forest to find Slender Man's mansion. Miraculously, Peyton Leutner survived. Despite her horrific injuries, she managed to crawl out of the woods to a path where a passing cyclist found her and called for help. The subsequent manhunt for the two 12-year-old girls captured national attention. They were found hours later near the interstate, with the knife still in Morgan Geyser's possession. The details that emerged during the investigation were chilling. The girls had been planning the attack for months. They had a specific date circled on a calendar. They had even attempted to carry it out once before, at a previous sleepover, but had lost their nerve. Their complete belief in the Slender Man mythology was evident in their statements to police. They expressed no remorse, only a matter-of-fact certainty that they had to do this to protect their families and become proxies. The case immediately ignited a fierce moral panic about the influence of online horror on impressionable young minds, with parents and pundits alike questioning the responsibility of internet creators and the need for close monitoring of children's online activities. The legal proceedings that followed were as complex as the case was bizarre. Both Morgan Geyser and Anissa Weier were charged as adults with attempted first-degree intentional homicide, a decision that itself sparked intense debate about the justice system's handling of severely mentally ill children. As their cases moved through court, a clearer picture of their mental states emerged. Anissa Weier's defense argued that she was under a shared psychotic delusion, telling the court she was not able to tell right from wrong due to a mental disease or defect. Morgan Geyser's case revealed an even more troubling layer. She was later diagnosed with early-onset schizophrenia, a severe mental illness that she had likely been suffering from for years, which made her particularly susceptible to the delusional narrative she and Anissa had constructed. In a series of plea deals, both girls were eventually convicted and sentenced to long-term commitment in mental health institutions rather than prison, a recognition that their actions were born not from inherent evil, but from profound psychological disturbance that went unrecognized and untreated. The Slender Man Stabbing is a tragic, multi-layered story that defies easy explanation. It is not simply a tale of internet horror gone wrong. It is a stark examination of childhood mental illness, the powerful bond of a folie à deux, a shared psychosis, and the terrifying vulnerability of young minds in an online world where the boundaries of fiction and reality are increasingly porous. It forces us to ask difficult questions about parental vigilance, the ethics of online content, and our society's ability to identify and help children who are spiraling into dangerous delusions long before a kitchen knife is ever pulled from a drawer. After the deeply unsettling and psychologically complex cases we've just explored, our next story offers a moment of almost comedic relief, a caper so audacious and ridiculous that it feels like a welcome palate cleanser. This is the legend of the Hot Pants Bandit, a robbery that combined cross-dressing, cold hard cash, and a flawless escape, all while looking absolutely fabulous. The scene was the Capital Bank and Trust Company in Miami, Florida, on a sweltering afternoon in July of 1971. As employees and customers went about their business, a new figure entered the bank. She was a striking woman, nearly 6 feet tall, with long, flowing auburn hair, stylish sunglasses, and an outfit that was certainly turning heads. She was wearing a form-fitting, brightly colored halter top and a pair of extremely short, tight shorts, the kind popularly known at the time as hot pants. The look was completed with strappy high-heeled sandals and a fashionable purse slung over her shoulder. In the context of 1970s Miami, the ensemble was bold and eye-catching, but not entirely out of place. The woman calmly approached a teller's window, reached into the purse, and instead of pulling out a lipstick or compact mirror, produced a large, menacing revolver. The mood in the bank shifted from casual to terrified in an instant. The bandit, speaking in a low, controlled voice, instructed the teller to fill the purse with cash. The teller complied, handing over bundles of bills. The thief then moved to a second teller, demanding more money. In total, the haul was a staggering $109,000, a massive sum for a single bank heist at the time. With the money securely in the purse, the Hot Pants Bandit didn't run or panic. They turned and walked with what witnesses described as a surprisingly confident and graceful stride in those high heels, right out the front door and into the humid Miami air, disappearing without a trace. The entire operation had taken just minutes, and it was executed with a cool efficiency that left the police initially baffled. The description of the robber immediately captured the public's imagination. Here was no ordinary criminal. This was a figure of almost theatrical flair. The idea that a bank could be so successfully robbed by someone in such a flamboyant and revealing disguise was both shocking and darkly humorous. The Hot Pants Bandit became an instant local legend, a folk hero of sorts who had outsmarted the system while making a bold fashion statement. The press had a field day, and the story was picked up by national wire services, turning the heist into a sensation. For years, the case grew colder and colder. Despite an intensive investigation, the Miami police had no solid leads. The bandit had left behind no fingerprints, no identifiable vehicle, and no witnesses who could provide a useful description of the face behind the sunglasses and wig. It seemed the perpetrator had pulled off the perfect crime and vanished into the ether. The truth, however, would eventually surface in the most unexpected way. The key to cracking the case wasn't a forensics breakthrough or a witness coming forward. It was the fragile ego of the criminal himself. The mastermind behind the heist was a man named Thomas Richard Harrison, a former police officer from Ohio who had moved to Florida. Harrison had planned the robbery meticulously, but he couldn't resist bragging about his brilliant success. He eventually confessed the entire scheme to an acquaintance, boasting about how he had fooled everyone with his female disguise. That acquaintance, unfortunately for Harrison, turned out to be an informant for the Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco and Firearms. The ATF was initially investigating Harrison for illegal firearms possession, but they suddenly found themselves with a lead on one of Miami's most famous unsolved bank robberies. Armed with this information, federal agents tracked down and arrested Harrison in 1975, nearly 4 years after the heist. Under questioning, his story unraveled. He admitted that the idea for the disguise came from watching his wife. He had practiced walking in her high heels for weeks to perfect his gait and mannerisms, ensuring he could move convincingly as a woman. The auburn wig and clothing were purchased specifically for the job. His plan was to create a disguise so memorable that witnesses would focus entirely on the outlandish outfit and not on any identifiable facial features, which were hidden by the big wig and sunglasses. It was a strategy of misdirection worthy of a magician, and it had worked perfectly until his own vanity and need for recognition led to his downfall. Thomas Harrison was convicted of bank robbery and sentenced to 15 years in federal prison. The legend of the Hot Pants Bandit, a story that blended crime with cross-dressing and sheer audacity, finally had an ending, proving that even the most cleverly disguised criminals can often be their own worst enemy. After stories of meticulously planned heists and chilling acts of violence, it's almost a relief to encounter a criminal scheme so fundamentally petty and absurd that it feels like it's from a different universe. This is the baffling tale of Paul Gonzalez, a man who turned the simple act of dating into a bizarre and lucrative con operation, earning himself the unforgettable nickname the Dine and Dash Dater. In the early 2000s, across upscale restaurants in California, Nevada, and Arizona, a strikingly handsome and impeccably dressed man was wining and dining a string of unsuspecting women. He introduced himself with various names, but his pattern was always the same. He would connect with his dates through personal ads or early online dating websites, presenting himself as a successful, charming, and sophisticated businessman. He would suggest meeting at the most expensive, exclusive restaurants he could find, the kind of places with white tablecloths, sommeliers, and menus that don't list prices. Once there, he would be the perfect gentleman, ordering multiple courses, selecting a premium bottle of wine, and engaging in seemingly deep and genuine conversation. His dates, flattered by the attention and the lavish setting, would have no reason to suspect that the entire evening was built on a lie. The climax of his scheme always came at the same moment when the check arrived. Gonzalez had a well-rehearsed routine for this. He would often excuse himself to use the restroom, sometimes claiming he felt ill, offering a convincing performance of discomfort. Other times, he would suggest they move to the bar for an after-dinner drink, proposing they settle the bill there. The moment his date's attention was diverted, Paul Gonzalez would simply vanish. He would slip out a side door, walk quickly through the kitchen, or simply bolt for the exit, leaving his bewildered companion alone at the table to face the music and the massive, unpaid check. The women were left not only with significant financial shock, but also with profound embarrassment and a sense of violation, having been used as unwitting pawns in his cheap, cruel game. For years, Gonzalez operated with impunity, hopping from city to city and state to state. He estimated later that he had pulled this stunt over 200 times, accumulating tens of thousands of dollars in unpaid tabs. His success relied on several factors. First, the sheer audacity of the crime made it hard to detect. restaurant staff and managers were more likely to assume a customer had genuinely forgotten to pay rather than suspect a premeditated plot. Second, the personal shame experienced by his victims often prevented them from immediately going to the police. Many women were too embarrassed to admit they had been duped in such a humiliating way, allowing Gonzalez to continue his spree without consequence. He wasn't just stealing from restaurants, he was stealing dignity and trust from every person he met. His downfall, like so many before him, came from his own growing confidence and carelessness. In 2003, he attempted his dine and dash routine at a popular restaurant in Santa Monica, California, but this time the manager was quicker to act. Suspicious of the man who had just fled after a large meal, the manager called the police and provided a detailed description. Because Gonzalez had been so brazenly operating in the area, local law enforcement already had a bulletin out for a suspect matching his description. He was apprehended a short time later. When investigators began digging, they uncovered the stunning scope of his cross-state dating scam. He was eventually charged with multiple counts of theft and defrauding an innkeeper. During his court appearances, the bizarre motive behind his crimes began to surface. Gonzalez didn't claim to need the money for survival or even for luxury. Instead, he described it as an addiction to excitement, a compulsive need to execute the perfect con and get away with it. He portrayed himself as a sort of gentleman thief, though there was nothing gentlemanly about humiliating his dates and sticking them with the bill. He was ultimately sentenced to 3 years in state prison, a surprisingly substantial sentence for a series of dinner bills, but one that reflected the calculated, repetitive, and psychologically damaging nature of his crimes. The story of the dine and dash dater stands as a perfect example of a crime that is less about financial gain and more about the twisted thrill of deception, proving that a con man doesn't need to target Fort Knox to leave a trail of confused and hurt victims in his wake. Sometimes the most critical break in a case doesn't come from a tip line or a forensics lab, but from a complete and total accident. Such was the situation in the spring of 2013 in Louisville, Kentucky, where a perfect technological fluke, the notorious butt dial, cracked a murder case wide open. It all started when the local 911 dispatch center received a call. There was no frantic voice on the other end, no desperate plea for help. Instead, operators heard only muffled, garbled noises, the kind of rustling and indistinct chatter that usually indicates a phone has been accidentally activated in someone's pocket or purse. Following standard procedure, the call was logged and then likely set aside, just another misdial in a long list of them. But this was no ordinary wrong number. A sharp-eared dispatcher, perhaps sensing something in the ambiguous background noise, made the crucial decision to pull the recording for further review. As the audio was cleaned and enhanced, the muffled sounds resolved into the clear voices of two men engaged in a conversation. And the subject of their discussion was not about sports or the weather. It was a chilling, detailed recap of a murder. The men could be heard calmly discussing the disposal of a body, the cleaning of a crime scene, and even expressing concern about whether there might be any remaining evidence that could link them to the crime. It was a full, uncensored confession, accidentally broadcast live to the authorities. The 911 call had been a perfect, incriminating recording, a gift from the universe that landed directly in the laps of the Louisville Metro Police Department. The immediate challenge for investigators was a classic one. They had the what, but they needed the who and the where. The recording was undeniable evidence of a homicide, but they had to identify the speakers and connect their conversation to an actual victim. Through meticulous work, they were able to trace the origins of the butt dial to a specific cell phone number and its registered owner, a man named Adrian Jones. With him identified, detectives now had a name and a voice to work with. They pulled every unsolved homicide case that might fit the timeline and circumstances discussed on the call. The pieces of the puzzle began to snap into place when they reviewed the case of 14-year-old Gregory Holt, also known by his street name, Glizzy. The teenager had been found shot to death in an alleyway nearly 2 months earlier in March of 2013. His murder had gone cold with no solid leads and no apparent motive. Armed with the recording, investigators brought Adrian Jones and the other man heard on the call, his accomplice Mario Doherty, in for questioning. They confronted them with the irrefutable evidence of their own words. The conversation on the recording was so specific, so detailed, that it left no room for denial. Faced with the audio, both men eventually confessed to their roles in the horrific crime. The motive, as is so often tragically the case, was startlingly petty. The two men claimed that the 14-year-old victim had stolen a $500 tax return check from Jones's girlfriend. This perceived disrespect and theft, a relatively small amount of money in the grand scheme, was enough for them to decide the boy deserved to die. They lured him to a secluded area under false pretenses where Jones shot him multiple times. The sheer randomness of the break in the case is what makes it so unforgettable. For 2 months, Adrian Jones and Mario Doherty had believed they had gotten away with murder. They had no reason to think anyone was listening when they chose to casually discuss the details of their heinous act, likely believing the crime was a closed chapter. They were undone not by a skilled detective or a witness finding their conscience, but by a quirk of modern technology, a phone sliding just the wrong way in a pocket, a button being pressed by denim instead of a finger. It was a mistake born of pure carelessness, a moment of technological irony that delivered their guilt on a silver platter. Jones was ultimately sentenced to 20 years in prison after pleading guilty to manslaughter and evidence tampering, while Doherty received a 15-year sentence for his part in the cover-up. The case of the butt dial confession serves as a darkly poetic reminder to every would-be criminal in the digital age. You might be careful about what you say to the police, but you should be even more careful about what you accidentally say to their emergency line. While the butt dial confession revealed a murder through sheer accidental luck, our next story presents a case where the criminal practically handed authorities a signed, sealed, and publicly delivered confession, leveraging the very tool of modern connection to broadcast his own guilt to the world. This is the disturbing saga of Derek Medina, a case so shocking it earned the grim nickname the Facebook Murder. On the morning of August 8, 2013, the social media platform Facebook became the scene of a crime in a way no one had ever seen before. Users scrolling through their news feeds were confronted with a post from a man named Derek Medina. It wasn't a vacation photo or a political rant. It was a graphic, horrifying image of a woman's lifeless body lying on the kitchen floor of a home, a visible pool of blood near her head. The caption accompanying the photo was even more chilling than the image itself. Medina had written in a calm and matter-of-fact tone, "I'm going to prison or death sentence for killing my wife." He went on to say, "Love you guys, miss you guys, take care Facebook people, you'll see me in the news." He then willingly signed off, "My name is Derek Medina." It was a surreal and stomach-turning moment, a violent crime announced to the world with the casualness of someone posting about what they had for lunch. The public reaction was one of immediate horror and disbelief. Comments on the post rapidly shifted from confusion to terror as people realized the image was real. Friends and family began frantically calling each other and the police. Within an astonishingly short period, just over an hour after the post first appeared, authorities arrived at the couple's townhouse in South Miami. They didn't have to break down the door. Derek Medina answered calmly and surrendered without resistance, readily admitting to the shooting death of his 26-year-old wife, Jennifer Alfonso. The evidence was waiting for them inside, exactly as he had depicted it online. The murder weapon, a semi-automatic pistol, was recovered at the scene. As the investigation unfolded, a deeply troubled portrait of Derek Medina and his marriage emerged. In the days and weeks leading up to the murder, Medina had been actively posting on his Facebook page, which he treated as a personal journal of sorts. His posts detailed a narrative of escalating domestic strife, painting himself as a victim in a volatile relationship. He claimed Jennifer was physically and verbally abusive toward him, allegations that would become the cornerstone of his eventual legal defense. He portrayed himself as a misunderstood husband and a self-published author of a book on relationship advice, a man pushed to his absolute limit. However, the reality of that final morning, as pieced together by prosecutors, told a very different and far more sinister story. The confrontation began over something seemingly trivial: burned food. Medina claimed that an argument erupted because Jennifer was angry he had burned some toast. This verbal fight quickly escalated. Medina later stated that Jennifer had threatened him with a knife, though no knife was found near her body. What is known for certain is that Derek Medina did not simply fire a single shot in a moment of panic. He shot his wife multiple times, with one of the bullets striking her in the back as she tried to flee. This detail severely undermined his claim of self-defense. After killing her, he did not call 911 or break down in remorse. Instead, he methodically took out his smartphone, positioned his wife's body, took a photograph, and then composed his now infamous Facebook confession. He then waited for the police to arrive, having already pronounced his own guilt to a global audience of horrified onlookers. The role of social media became the defining and most bizarre aspect of the entire case. Medina's decision to post the photo was not a spontaneous cry for help. It was a calculated, though profoundly twisted, act. During his trial, forensic psychologists suggested that his actions were a grotesque form of grandstanding, an attempt to control the narrative and achieve a perverse kind of fame or notoriety. He wanted to be seen, to have his story told on his terms, even if that story ended with him in prison for life. It was a stark and early example of how social media platforms could be weaponized, not just as a tool for planning crime, but as a stage for its aftermath, transforming a domestic tragedy into a grotesque public spectacle. In the end, Medina's own post served as the most damning evidence against him. After initially pleading not guilty and attempting to use a stand-your-ground defense, he eventually changed his plea to no contest in 2016 to avoid a potential death sentence. He was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. The case of Derek Medina remains a chilling landmark in the annals of true crime, a horrifying example of how a moment of extreme violence can be instantly curated and broadcast to the world, forcing us to confront the dark and unsettling ways technology is forever intertwined with the human capacity for evil. Just when you thought you'd seen every type of bank robber, the desperate, the deranged, the meticulously professional, along comes a criminal who defies every stereotype and redefines the very image of a threat. In the world of heists, where perpetrators are often young, desperate, or violently aggressive, the appearance of a gentle, elderly man quietly passing a note to a teller seems almost preposterous. Yet that is precisely the bewildering profile of the man who would become known as the Grandpa Bandit, a soft-spoken senior citizen who, between 2009 and 2011, embarked on a surprising crime spree across the American South that left investigators and the public utterly baffled. His approach was the polar opposite of the violent, gun-wielding robberies that dominate the news. There was no shouting, no waving of weapons, no frantic escapes. Instead, his method was one of quiet, almost polite intimidation. He would walk into a bank, often wearing a simple baseball cap, glasses, and casual clothing, the very picture of a kindly grandfather running errands. He would patiently wait in line, and when it was his turn, he would calmly slide a note across the counter to the teller. The message was always some variation of a simple, chilling demand: "I have a gun. Give me the money, no one will get hurt." His demeanor was so calm, so unassuming, that tellers often reported feeling more confused than frightened at first, unable to reconcile the grandfatherly man in front of them with the threatening words on the page. He never raised his voice, he never showed a weapon. He would simply take the cash, quietly thank the teller, and walk out at a leisurely pace, disappearing into the everyday traffic of the suburban streets. This pattern repeated itself over and over again across multiple states, including Florida, Georgia, and North Carolina. The FBI, tasked with connecting these seemingly disconnected robberies, quickly noticed the unique signature. Here was a robber who relied entirely on the power of suggestion and the sheer improbability of his appearance. He was a ghost, leaving behind no forensic evidence, no identifiable vehicle, and witnesses who could only describe him as an older white male, a description that fit thousands of innocent men in every community he targeted. The Grandpa Bandit moniker was born from this frustrating paradox. He was at once highly successful and completely invisible, using his age as the perfect disguise to operate in plain sight. The public was captivated. How could a man in his 70s, an age most associated with retirement and relaxation, be pulling off these brazen crimes? Was he a desperate pensioner, a lifelong criminal finally caught on tape, or was he something else entirely, a man embarking on a bizarre late-life crisis, seeking thrills and cash in equal measure? The break in the case came not from a high-tech surveillance system or an undercover operation, but from a tipster who saw the wanted poster the FBI had circulated. The grainy surveillance photos showed a man with a familiar posture and gait. In May 2011, that tip led investigators to the doorstep of 74-year-old Lawrence Eugene Keene in Fayetteville, North Carolina. The reality of the Grandpa Bandit's life was far less romantic than the folk hero image some had imagined. Keene was not a destitute senior struggling to make ends meet. He was a retired military veteran and a former employee of the Department of Defense. He lived a comfortable, quiet life with his wife. His motive, it seemed, was not desperation born of poverty, but something perhaps more complex, a desire for excitement, a need for supplemental income to maintain a certain lifestyle, or simply the belief that he could get away with it because no one would ever suspect him. When authorities arrested him, they found a stash of evidence linking him to at least 7 bank robberies with a total haul of over $10,000. The quiet, unassuming man who had spent his life serving his country and working a government job had, in his golden years, chosen a path of bizarre criminality. In court, he pleaded guilty to multiple federal bank robbery charges. The judge, faced with such an unusual defendant, sentenced him to 4 years in federal prison. The case of the Grandpa Bandit closed not with a dramatic shootout or a daring escape, but with the quiet admission of guilt from an elderly man who had discovered, too late, that even the most effective disguise eventually falters. His story endures as a strange and poignant chapter in American crime, a reminder that criminality has no age limit and that sometimes the most unassuming face can hide the most unexpected secrets. Perhaps no single crime in the 21st century has spawned more urban legends and pop culture panic than the horrifying event that unfolded on a sunny afternoon in Miami, Florida, on May 26, 2012. It was a scene so grotesque, so far outside the boundaries of normal human behavior, that the only frame of reference for the stunned witnesses and the police who arrived was the stuff of horror films. That day, along the MacArthur Causeway, a 31-year-old man named Ruddy Eugene launched a vicious, inexplicable attack on a 65-year-old homeless man named Ronald Puppo. The assault was not a typical act of violence. It was a sustained, primal, and cannibalistic frenzy. When police arrived, they found Eugene naked and snarling on top of Puppo, relentlessly mauling him and chewing off chunks of his face. Despite repeated orders to stop, Eugene only growled in response and continued his attack, forcing an officer to fire his weapon, killing Eugene. Ronald Puppo, horrifically disfigured and having lost 75% of his face, miraculously survived. In the immediate aftermath, with details still scarce and the images too shocking to process, the world struggled for an explanation. The incident was instantly and sensationally dubbed the Miami Zombie Attack, a label that ignited a firestorm of speculation and fear about a new wave of drugs that could turn users into mindless, flesh-eating monsters. The primary theory that emerged from investigators, and the one that has been most widely accepted, points to a potent and dangerous synthetic drug known as flakka or gravel. This laboratory-made stimulant, chemically known as alpha-PVP, is a cousin to the better-known bath salts. Its effects are notoriously volatile and extreme, inducing a state of extreme agitation, paranoia, superhuman strength, and hypothermia, where the user's body temperature can skyrocket to dangerous levels. Crucially, it can also cause a condition called excited delirium, characterized by severe agitation, aggression, and a terrifying tolerance for pain, which explains why Ruddy Eugene was unfazed by police commands and continued his attack. While a toxicology report confirmed only cannabis in Eugene's system, the case was officially attributed to cannabis-induced psychotic disorder, a conclusion many experts find deeply unsatisfying given the sheer extremity of the violence. The Miami-Dade Medical Examiner's Office noted that synthetic drugs like flakka are notoriously difficult to detect in standard toxicology screens and can metabolize out of the system very quickly, leaving open the strong possibility that Eugene was under the influence of an undetected synthetic cathinone. This horrific event immediately became the poster incident for the dangers of these new, unregulated substances, triggering a nationwide panic about so-called zombie drugs and leading to a wave of sensationalistic media coverage that often prioritized fear over facts. The cultural impact of the Ronald Poppo attack was immediate and profound, rippling far beyond the realm of criminal justice and into the very heart of modern mythology. The term zombie was no longer just a fictional trope from movies and television. It was now a terrifying potential reality being discussed on news channels and in government health advisories. This single event fueled a moral panic that shaped drug policy and public perception for years. Legislators rushed to enact bans on the chemical compounds used in flakka and bath salts, and public health campaigns latched onto the gruesome imagery to warn young people away from experimenting with synthetic drugs. The case became a macabre touchstone, a go-to reference for the potential worst-case scenario of drug abuse. Yet, this framing also came with a significant downside. It risked dehumanizing both the victim and the perpetrator, reducing a complex human tragedy involving mental illness, addiction, and poverty to a simple, sensational monster narrative. Ronald Poppo became known globally as the man who had his face eaten, a label that defined him by his victimhood, while Ruddy Eugene was cast as a mindless zombie, stripping away any context of his life and struggles. The reality was undoubtedly more complicated, a perfect and tragic storm of potent substances, potentially underlying mental health issues, and the vulnerabilities of two men living on the margins of society, whose lives collided in a way that was as random as it was horrifying. The attack on the MacArthur Causeway remains a deeply unsettling chapter, not just for its sheer brutality, but for the way it forced us to confront the terrifying and sometimes literal demons that can be unleashed by the chemicals we create. From the primal, drug-fueled horror of the Miami Causeway, we turn to a crime born not from altered states of mind, but from a very different yet equally potent modern addiction: the obsession with fame, luxury, and the curated perfection of celebrity life. This is the story of the Bling Ring, a group of seemingly typical San Fernando Valley teenagers who turned their voracious appetite for celebrity gossip and designer labels into a real-life crime spree that targeted the very stars they idolized. The operation began not with a complex blueprint, but with a simple internet search. In 2008, ringleader Rachel Lee and her friend Nick Prugo, along with a rotating cast of other teens including Alexis Nyers and Courtney Ames, realized that the lavish lives of celebrities were not as private as one might think. Using celebrity gossip websites like TMZ and Perez Hilton, they could track the travel schedules of their targets. If a star was photographed at a movie premiere in London or a fashion show in Paris, it was a safe bet their multi-million-dollar home in the Hollywood Hills would be empty. From there, it was just a matter of using Google Maps to find the address and then driving up the winding canyon roads to scope out the property. Their methods for entry were often shockingly low-tech. They would simply check for unlocked doors or open windows. If those were secured, they'd sometimes find a hidden key under a mat or, in at least one instance, break a glass door with a rock they found in the garden. Their confidence was as audacious as it was naive. They operated less like master thieves and more like entitled party crashers who believed the entire world of luxury was theirs for the taking. Their list of victims reads like a who's who of young Hollywood at the time. They repeatedly hit the home of Paris Hilton, making off with over $2 million in jewelry, handbags, and clothing. They targeted Orlando Bloom, Lindsay Lohan, and Rachel Bilson, among others. The sheer volume of their thefts was staggering, with the total haul estimated at around $3 million in cash, clothing, and goods. But the true psychology of the bling ring is what makes their story so uniquely modern and disturbing. This wasn't primarily about the money. They weren't fencing the stolen Rolexes to pay rent. They were stealing the lifestyle itself. They would take iconic items directly from a celebrity's closet. A pair of Lindsay Lohan's leggings, a necklace Audrina Patridge had been photographed wearing, and then incorporate them into their own wardrobes, wearing them to parties and posting pictures on their social media pages. They were engaging in a bizarre form of identity theft, draping themselves in the literal garments of fame in an attempt to feel closer to the glamorous world they consumed daily through their screens. Their eventual downfall was as rooted in their vanity as their crimes were. They couldn't resist documenting their own exploits. They took trophy photos of each other posing with stacks of stolen cash, trying on stolen jewelry, and lounging in the very homes they were looting. These images, along with their bragging on social media, created a digital trail of evidence that was impossible to ignore. When investigators finally caught on, the evidence was overwhelming. The story exploded in the media, becoming a perfect tabloid storm of youth, glamour, and crime. It was a narrative that fascinated and repulsed the public in equal measure, leading to a famed Vanity Fair article and later a film by Sofia Coppola. The members of the Bling Ring were eventually arrested and faced a mix of prison sentences and probation. Their saga serves as a dark allegory for the 21st century, a stark warning about the dangers of celebrity worship and the blurred line between aspiration and delusion, where the desire to be seen and admired can override every last shred of morality and common sense. While the Bling Ring's crimes were driven by a shallow craving for glamour, our next case plunges us into a depth of human darkness that is almost unbearable to contemplate. A serial predator who operated in the shadows of Los Angeles for over 2 decades, his reign of terror marked by long, eerie silences that left investigators and a community desperate for answers. This is the horrifying story of Lonnie Franklin Jr., the man the press would later call the Grim Sleeper. The name itself sends a chill down the spine, evoking a monster from a nightmare who wakes only to kill. The case began not with a single event, but with a slow, dawning realization for the Los Angeles Police Department. In the 1980s, a series of murders began to surface in south-central Los Angeles, a community already grappling with high crime rates and often strained relations with police. The victims were almost all young black women, many who were involved in sex work or struggling with addiction, making them devastatingly vulnerable targets. They were shot, strangled, and their bodies were often dumped in alleyways or abandoned lots. The killings were brutal, and they shared a distinct signature, but in a city grappling with a rising tide of violence, these deaths were, for a time, tragically overlooked by an overburdened system. The first officially linked attack occurred in August 1985 with the death of 29-year-old Deborah Jackson. but the true horror of the pattern wouldn't become clear until several years later. The killer seemed to operate in a terrifying cycle. There was a cluster of murders between 1985 and 1988. Then, in 1988, the killings just stopped. For over a decade, there was a profound and unsettling silence. The task force that had been assembled saw their leads grow cold, and the case files gathered dust. It seemed the killer had simply vanished. This long pause is what earned him his nickname in the press. He was the Grim Sleeper, a phantom who had apparently gone dormant. But in 2002, the sleep ended. The killings started again with the same method, the same victim profile, the same monstrous signature. The monster was back, and the city was once again gripped with fear. The investigation was a monumental challenge from the start. The LAPD was criticized for not dedicating more resources to the case earlier, a reflection of the tragic reality that the deaths of marginalized women of color often fail to generate the same urgent public and institutional response as other crimes. As pressure mounted, the newly formed Grim Sleeper Task Force employed every technique at their disposal. They had one crucial piece of evidence: the killer's DNA collected from several crime scenes. For years, they ran that DNA through every available database, but it never produced a match. The killer had no prior felony convictions that would have forced him to submit a sample. He was a ghost hiding in plain sight. The breakthrough, when it finally came, was a masterpiece of modern forensic genealogy and inventive police work. In 2007, California passed a proposition allowing for something called familial DNA searching. This revolutionary technique doesn't look for a direct match in the database. Instead, it looks for very close, partial matches, people who are likely to be close relatives of the unknown suspect. In 2010, the Grim Sleeper's DNA produced such a partial match. It was linked to a man named Christopher Franklin, who was in the system due to a felony weapons conviction. Christopher Franklin was not the Grim Sleeper, but the DNA suggested he was likely the killer's son. From there, it was a matter of traditional detective work. Investigators built a family tree and identified Christopher's father, a 57-year-old mechanic and former city garage attendant named Lonnie Franklin Jr. He was a married father and grandfather who lived in a modest home in South Los Angeles, a man his neighbors described as a friendly, handy guy who fixed cars on his driveway. He was the last person anyone would suspect. To confirm their suspicion without alerting him, investigators needed a sample of his DNA. They devised a plan straight out of a spy novel. Undercover officers followed Franklin to a restaurant. After he finished his meal and left, they swooped in and collected his discarded pizza crust, napkins, and drinking glasses, all items laden with his saliva and DNA. The samples were rushed to the lab, and the result was the moment investigators had waited a quarter century for: a perfect match. Lonnie Franklin Jr. was the Grim Sleeper. In July 2010, he was arrested at his home. A subsequent search of that home revealed a horror museum of souvenirs. Police found hundreds of photographs of women, many in various states of undress and appearing drugged or unconscious. They also found a handgun that was later ballistically matched to the murders. The sheer volume of photos suggested his victim count was likely far higher than the 10 women he was initially charged with killing. At his trial, the full scope of his depravity was laid bare. The prosecution presented a meticulously built case, including the DNA evidence and the testimony of the one victim who had survived his attack. In 1988, a woman known only as Anitra was shot in the chest, sexually assaulted, and then photographed by her attacker as she lay dying in his car. Miraculously, she was thrown from the vehicle and survived, and her incredible testimony from decades earlier perfectly described Lonnie Franklin. In May 2016, after a long and emotionally draining trial, Lonnie Franklin Jr. was convicted of 10 counts of murder and 1 count of attempted murder. He was sentenced to death, though he remains on California's death row. The case of the Grim Sleeper is a story of immense tragedy, of a system that failed to protect its most vulnerable citizens for far too long, but it is also a story of relentless perseverance. It showcased the powerful evolution of forensic science, proving that even the most elusive ghosts can be dragged into the light, and finally giving a measure of justice to victims whose voices had been silenced for decades. As the unrelenting pursuit of justice in the Grim Sleeper case demonstrated, even the most elusive predators can eventually be found, their identities dragged into the light by the relentless march of forensic science. This brings us to another monster who believed his reign of terror was a permanent secret, a man whose method was so distinct and so cruel that he earned one of the most haunting monikers in the history of American crime, the pillowcase rapist. For over a decade, from the late 1970s through the 1980s, South Florida was held captive by a phantom. Women from Miami to the Florida Keys lived in a state of constant low-grade fear, their sense of security in their own homes utterly shattered. The attacker's pattern was always the same, a nightmare script repeated with chilling precision. He would prowl affluent neighborhoods, targeting single-family homes and apartment complexes, often gaining entry through an unlocked sliding glass door or a window left ajar to catch the ocean breeze. Once inside, he would move with a predatory silence, often finding his victims as they slept. His weapon of choice was never a gun or a knife. It was an object of mundane domesticity that he transformed into an instrument of pure terror, a pillowcase snatched from the very bed he was violating. He would use it to cover his victim's head, blinding them, disorienting them, and robbing them of their last visual connection to their own safe space. This act was more than just practical, it was deeply psychological, a way to depersonalize his victims and assert total, absolute control. In the utter blackness beneath the fabric, the women could only hear his voice, a calm and almost conversational tone as he issued threats and demands, all while committing brutal sexual assaults. He would often ransack the home afterward, taking jewelry and cash, trying to frame the attacks as robberies gone wrong, but the police knew better. They were hunting a serial rapist, a ghost who left behind no fingerprints, no usable descriptions, and a growing list of traumatized survivors who could only describe the sound of his voice and the feel of the pillowcase. The investigation was a massive and frustrating undertaking for law enforcement across multiple jurisdictions. The pillowcase rapist was astonishingly prolific, eventually linked to over 100 sexual assaults. Yet, despite dozens of detectives working the case, hundreds of evidence samples, and countless composite sketches based on the fragmented memories of traumatized victims, he remained a ghost. The break everyone was praying for finally seemed to arrive in 1981, when a tip led police to a young man named Robert Anthony Bucci, who bore a striking resemblance to one of the composite sketches. He was arrested and charged with several of the attacks. The community breathed a sigh of relief. The monster had been caught. The only problem was they had the wrong man. While Bucci was awaiting trial, the real pillowcase rapist struck again, his method identical, his brutality unchanged. The charges against Bucci were eventually dropped, but the damage was done. The real predator had been given a gift. The authorities now believed their prime suspect was in custody, allowing him to continue his spree with even greater impunity. He eventually expanded his territory northward, carrying out attacks in Orlando and Tampa. Then, as mysteriously as he had appeared, he stopped. The attacks ceased in the mid-1980s. The case, once the highest priority, grew colder with each passing year, relegated to a backlog of unsolved files, a painful open wound for the survivors and the detectives who had failed to catch him. The story of the pillowcase rapist seemed destined to remain one of Florida's most painful cold cases, a chapter of terror that would never see justice. But the seeds of his downfall had actually been planted during his own reign of terror, though the technology to read them did not yet exist. In many of the assaults, the assailant had left behind crucial biological evidence. At the time, the best forensic science could do was blood typing, which could only eliminate a suspect, not definitively identify one. The evidence kits, however, were meticulously preserved in police property rooms, waiting for the day science could finally give them a voice. That day arrived decades later with the advent of DNA profiling. In the early 2000s, as part of an initiative to review cold cases with new forensic tools, evidence from the pillowcase rapist attacks was submitted for analysis. The result was a DNA profile, a unique genetic fingerprint that finally put a name to the phantom. But there was a new problem. The profile did not match anyone in the growing national database of convicted offenders. The pillowcase rapist had never been arrested for another crime that would require a DNA sample. He was still a ghost, but now he had a name written in a code they could read, even if they didn't know who it belonged to. The final act of this decades-long hunt began with a clever and tenacious detective named Danny Moschella of the Miami-Dade Police Department. Refusing to let the case die, she began re-examining the old suspect lists from the 1980s. One name stood out: Robert Dyers. He had been interviewed back in 1981 because he drove a vehicle similar to one seen near a crime scene, but he had been dismissed as a suspect. Moschella decided to take a second look. She discovered that Dyers, now in his early 60s, was living a quiet, unassuming life as a nurse in a retirement community in Port St. Lucie, Florida. He had no criminal record. He was a healthcare professional, someone trusted to care for the elderly and infirm. To everyone who knew him, he was a kind and gentle man. It was the perfect hiding place. Detective Moschella needed a sample of his DNA to compare to the profile from the crime scenes. Using a technique that has since become a standard tool for cold case investigators, she and her team began surveillance on Dyers, waiting for him to discard something that would carry his genetic signature. The opportunity soon presented itself when he threw away a used paper napkin while eating at a fast food restaurant. Detectives collected the trash, retrieved the napkin, and sent it to the lab. The DNA was a perfect match. In 2020, nearly 40 years after his last known attack, Robert Dyers was arrested. Confronted with the irrefutable evidence, he eventually pleaded guilty to over 30 sexual assaults, though authorities believe his true victim count is well over 100. He was sentenced to life in prison, finally bringing a long-delayed but deeply powerful measure of justice to the survivors who had waited a lifetime to see the man who hid behind the pillowcase. His capture stands as a testament to the persistence of law enforcement and the incredible power of forensic science to solve the unsolvable, proving that time does not erase guilt, it only provides more time to find the truth. In a world increasingly connected by social media, we often share our happiest moments online: birthdays, vacations, achievements. But in a tragic and horrifying case from 2015, a young woman used her Twitter account not to celebrate life, but to document the final, terrifying moments of her own. This is the story of 21-year-old Dalia Mohammed, a case that starkly illustrates both the terrifying vulnerability and the unprecedented power of our digital lives during a crisis. It began on the evening of January 13th in a quiet neighborhood of Phoenix, Arizona. Dalia, a vibrant and popular young woman with a large following on Twitter, found herself in a terrifying situation. Her ex-boyfriend, 22-year-old Edward Dean Saad, was outside her home, enraged and refusing to leave. What followed was a real-time digital cry for help that would captivate and horrify the world. Her first tweet on the subject was a simple, desperate plea to her thousands of followers. "This dude is not letting me sleep, he's outside my house." The tweets that followed over the next hour painted a picture of escalating terror. She documented his attempts to break in, writing, "He's trying to break my back door," and "He's trying to break my window." She reached out for any form of assistance, her messages becoming a heartbreaking live feed of a home invasion. She tweeted at the Phoenix Police Department directly, asking, "How long does it take for a police officer to come?" And later, in a moment of sheer panic, "He's trying to kill me." Her followers, watching this nightmare unfold in real time, were frantic. They began flooding the Phoenix Police's non-emergency lines and social media accounts, begging them to send help to her address. They felt a visceral, helpless connection to her plight, transformed from a passive audience into an active, desperate bystander network. Despite this digital alarm bell ringing loudly across the platform, the real-world response was fatally delayed. The Phoenix Police Department did receive calls, but they were logged as a check welfare call, a lower priority designation than a burglary in progress or domestic violence emergency. Crucial minutes ticked by as officers were dispatched. Inside the house, the situation reached its horrific climax. Edward Dean Saad succeeded in breaking in. The live Twitter updates, which had been a constant stream of fear, suddenly stopped. The final tweet from Dahlia Mohaim's account was a single, devastating word: help. When police finally arrived on the scene, they found Dahlia and her mother, 42-year-old Ola Mohammed, both deceased. They had been stabbed to death. Edward Dean Saad was still at the scene and was taken into custody without incident. The aftermath was a complex storm of grief, outrage, and difficult questions. Dahlia's friends and followers were heartbroken and angry. How could a crime broadcast so publicly to the world still end in such tragedy? The Phoenix Police Department faced intense scrutiny over their response time and their protocols for handling distress signals that come through social media. An internal investigation revealed a critical failure in communication. The information from the 911 callers who had seen the tweets was not fully conveyed to the dispatchers or the officers en route, who were not aware of the imminent, life-threatening danger inside the home. The case of the so-called Twitter murder became a grim landmark in the intersection of technology, social media, and public safety. It powerfully demonstrated the potential of these platforms to serve as a lifeline, a way to summon a virtual army of helpers in an instant. But it also exposed its profound limitations. A tweet is not a 911 call. It does not provide a verified location to a dispatcher, nor does it guarantee an immediate, prioritized emergency response. The digital cries for help can be seen by thousands, but they can still fail to reach the one person who needs to see them most, the police officer driving to the scene. In the end, Edward Dean Saad was sentenced to 2 life terms in prison without the possibility of parole. Dahlia Mohaim's Twitter feed remains online, a permanent, public, and heartbreaking memorial to a young woman who tried to use the tools of her generation to save her own life, and in doing so, left behind an urgent call for us all to re-examine how we respond to distress in the digital age. From the grim and methodical predation of the pillowcase rapist, we now pivot to a crime born not in the shadows, but in the blinding, arrogant glare of California sunshine and unimaginable privilege. This is the story of the Billionaire Boys Club, a tale where the intoxicating allure of wealth and the unshakable belief in one's own genius curdled into a deadly mixture of fraud, delusion, and murder. The saga began not with a whimper but with a boast. In the early 1980s, at the peak of the greed is good era, a brilliant and intensely charismatic young man named Joe Hunt founded an investment group in Los Angeles. He recruited his members from the most elite private high schools and universities in the state, young men from wealthy, well-connected families who already moved in the rarefied air of extreme privilege. Hunt's sales pitch was as audacious as it was simple. He presented a complex, pseudo-intellectual trading philosophy he called the process, which he claimed could generate guaranteed, astronomical returns through arbitrage trading in the commodities market. He spoke in a confusing, hypnotic jargon of economic theory, convincing his eager acolytes that he had discovered a flaw in the global financial system that only they were smart enough to exploit. The promise was irresistible. They would all become billionaires, and they would do it before any of them turned 30. They gave themselves a suitably swaggering name, the Billionaire Boys Club, or BBC. For a while, the illusion held, using money from an ever-growing list of investors, often the parents and relatives of the club members themselves. Hunt created a dazzling facade of success. The BBC leased a luxurious office, drove expensive cars, and threw lavish parties. They were the talk of the Los Angeles social scene, these golden boys who seemed to have cracked the code to infinite wealth. But the process was a complete and total fiction. There were no brilliant trades, no secret arbitrage loopholes. The entire operation was a classic Ponzi scheme. Hunt was simply using money from new investors to pay out fabricated returns to earlier ones, all while siphoning off millions to fund the BBC's absurdly opulent lifestyle. The entire enterprise was a glittering soap bubble, and it was only a matter of time before it popped. The pin that burst the bubble was named Ron Levin, a well-known con man and playboy in his own right. Levin invested a significant amount of money with the BBC, but grew suspicious when Hunt couldn't provide a coherent explanation for his incredible returns. Levin then turned the tables on his young protege, essentially blackmailing him. The confrontation that followed would spiral into unimaginable violence. In June of 1984, Hunt and several BBC members lured Levin to his own Beverly Hills home. Their plan, as later detailed in court, was to force him to sign over a $20 million check and a confession letter admitting he had stolen from them. But the situation spiraled out of control. Hunt shot and killed Levin in his living room. The group then staged a scene to make it look like Levin had accidentally shot himself while cleaning his gun before stuffing his body into a sleeping bag, dragging it to the trunk of a car, and disposing of it in a remote area of the Los Angeles National Forest. Ron Levin's body has never been found. The murder of Levin was a desperate, catastrophic attempt to save the Ponzi scheme, but it only accelerated its collapse. The pressure and paranoia within the BBC intensified dramatically. Just a month later, the group targeted another potential threat, a former member named Dean Carney who had become disillusioned and was asking too many questions. Hunt and his associates kidnapped Carney, holding him hostage for days and terrorizing him into recounting his doubts and signing a false confession. Miraculously, Carney was eventually released and immediately went to the police. The entire sordid story began to unravel. The subsequent investigation and trial became a national media circus, a perfect storm of money, murder, and youthful betrayal. Joe Hunt, acting as his own attorney, delivered grand philosophical monologues in the courtroom, attempting to baffle the jury with the same kind of convoluted logic he had used on his investors. He claimed Ron Levin was still alive and had faked his own death, a story the prosecution easily dismantled. The jury saw through the facade, convicting Hunt of first-degree murder and sentencing him to life in prison without the possibility of parole. Other key members of the BBC also received lengthy prison sentences for their roles in the fraud and the kidnapping. The story of the Billionaire Boys Club endures as a chilling cautionary tale about the dark side of the American dream, a stark reminder that unchecked ambition and a belief in one's own infallibility can be a poison just as deadly as any weapon, turning the pursuit of $1 billion into a one-way ticket to a prison cell. While the Billionaire Boys Club's crimes were fueled by cold calculation and a God complex, our next story introduces us to a criminal whose motive and method were utterly bewildering, a series of heists that felt less like robberies and more like performance art pieces staged by a deeply troubled mind. This is the bizarre case of the Laughing Bandit, a woman who turned the high-stakes tension of a bank robbery into a theater of the absurd. For several months in 2011, a series of bank holdups across the Dallas-Fort Worth area in Texas left tellers, security guards, and police detectives completely baffled. The robber didn't fit any known profile. She wasn't aggressive or threatening in a conventional sense. Instead, her weapon was a sound, a loud, uncontrollable, and deeply unsettling maniacal laugh. Her pattern was always the same. She would enter a bank, often wearing a hat and sunglasses, approach a teller and pass a note demanding money. But as the teller read the note, the woman would simply start laughing. It wasn't a chuckle or a giggle. It was a full-bodied, hysterical cackle that echoed through the quiet bank, drawing the attention of everyone in the building. She would laugh as the teller, utterly confused and disarmed by the bizarre behavior, hurried to fill a bag with cash. She would laugh as she took the bag. And she would often still be laughing as she walked calmly out the door and disappeared. It was as if she found the entire terrifying situation to be the most hilarious joke in the world. Witnesses were left not just scared but deeply unnerved. The laughter had a psychotic, unhinged quality to it that was far more frightening than any shouted threat could ever be. It created a surreal and deeply confusing atmosphere, short-circuiting the normal fear response and replacing it with sheer bewilderment. Security guards reported being so thrown off by the sound that they hesitated to act, unsure if they were witnessing a real crime or some kind of elaborate prank. The laughter was her perfect disguise and her perfect weapon, a psychological smokescreen that allowed her to operate with brazen efficiency. The media, of course, latched onto the story, dubbing her the Laughing Bandit or the Giggling Bandit, names that sounded almost playful but belied the truly strange and disturbing nature of the crimes. The break in the case came from a combination of sharp-eyed witnesses and detective work. After one particularly bold heist, a bystander outside the bank managed to get a clear look at the woman's getaway car and recorded a partial license plate number. This gave investigators a crucial lead. They began cross-referencing vehicle records with witness descriptions and quickly identified a suspect, a 40-year-old woman named Mynacia Johnson. When police tracked her down and arrested her, the laughing finally stopped, but the mystery was far from over. In police interviews, a much sadder and more complex picture began to emerge. Mynacia Johnson was not a hardened criminal. She was a mother, and by all accounts, she had no prior history of violence or theft. So what could possibly drive a woman to rob banks while cackling like a cartoon villain? The answer, as she explained to investigators, was a profound and untreated mental health crisis. Johnson revealed that she had been struggling with severe depression and anxiety for years. She described the laughter not as something she could control, but as an involuntary reaction to extreme stress and fear. It was a pathological response, a coping mechanism that manifested at the worst possible moments. The immense pressure of committing a felony, of walking into a bank knowing she could be caught or shot, triggered this bizarre hysterical reaction. The laughter that so terrified everyone else was for her a symptom of her own internal terror. She wasn't laughing at the situation, she was quite literally having a breakdown in the middle of it. Her defense attorney would later argue that she was in the grips of a dissociative state during the robberies, a psychological disconnect between her actions and her awareness of them. The case of the Laughing Bandit took a tragic turn in the courtroom. While the crimes themselves were serious felonies, the context of her mental state presented a complex challenge for the justice system. Johnson was eventually sentenced to prison, but her story sparked a difficult conversation about how the legal system handles defendants grappling with severe mental illness. Was she a calculated criminal, or was she a sick woman in desperate need of treatment rather than punishment? Her case serves as a stark and unsettling reminder that not all crime stems from greed or malice. Sometimes it erupts from a place of profound inner turmoil, a desperate and broken cry for help that manifests in the most bizarre and public way imaginable. The laughter has long since faded from those bank lobbies, but the echo of her story remains, a haunting soundbite from the blurred line between criminality and mental health. While the previous cases exposed the terrible consequences of greed, mental illness, or the hunger for fame, our next story delves into a darkness born from a completely different source, a literal descent into madness where fantasy and reality became so horrifyingly entangled that it led to a blood-soaked ritual in a Florida suburb. This is the profoundly disturbing case of the so-called vampire cult murders, a crime that forced America to confront the terrifying power of delusion and the blurred lines between adolescent rebellion and pure evil. The story centers on a 16-year-old boy from Murray, Kentucky, named Rod Ferrell. By all accounts, Ferrell's upbringing was deeply troubled. His parents were involved in the occult, and he was exposed to a world of seances, dark rituals, and supernatural beliefs from a very young age. He was a bright but deeply disturbed teenager who found solace not in sports or academics, but in the burgeoning goth subculture and the world of Vampire the Masquerade, a popular role-playing game where players assume the identities of powerful, ancient vampires. For Ferrell and his small group of friends, this wasn't just a game. It became their entire identity. They began to genuinely believe they were vampires, adopting names from the game. Ferrell called himself Versago, and engaging in rituals where they would drink each other's blood, believing it granted them strength and power. They were outcasts who had created their own family, a clan bound by a shared fantasy that was rapidly curdling into something much more dangerous. In November 1996, Ferrell's delusions took a violent turn. He concocted a plan to travel to Florida with his 15-year-old girlfriend, Heather Wendorf, and 2 other followers, to escape what he saw as oppressive parents and authorities and to establish their own vampire coven. But for Ferrell, this journey needed a baptism in blood. On the night of November 25th, Ferrell and his group broke into the Florida home of Richard and Ruth Wendorf, Heather's parents. What happened inside was a scene of unimaginable brutality. Using a crowbar, Rod Ferrell bludgeoned both parents to death in their sleep. The violence was so extreme that the initial coroner's report noted the victims' skulls had been crushed. The teenagers then ransacked the house, stole the Wendorf station wagon, and fled, eventually making it all the way to Louisiana before they were caught. The arrest and subsequent trials became a national media circus, with a fascinated and horrified public trying to understand how a group of teenagers could commit such a heinous act. The prosecution painted Ferrell as a manipulative and cold-blooded mastermind who had seduced his followers into a world of darkness. The defense, however, argued that he was a severely mentally ill young man, a product of a horrific upbringing who was unable to distinguish the fantasy of his vampire persona from the reality of his actions. The case ignited a fierce moral panic about the influence of role-playing games, heavy metal music, and the goth subculture, with pundits and parents alike blaming these outlets for corrupting the youth. This backlash, however, often overlooked the deeper, more distressing truths at the heart of the case: severe child neglect, untreated mental illness, and the desperate need for belonging that can make a vulnerable teenager susceptible to the worst kinds of manipulation. In the end, Rod Ferrell, perhaps seeking notoriety until the very last moment, initially pleaded guilty to 2 counts of first-degree murder, then dramatically changed his plea to not guilty by reason of insanity. The jury rejected this defense, finding him fully aware of his actions. In a stunning and historic decision, the 16-year-old was sentenced to death, becoming the youngest person on Florida's death row at the time. His sentence was later commuted to life in prison without parole after a Supreme Court ruling on the execution of juveniles. His accomplices received lengthy prison sentences. The vampire cult murders remain a chilling cautionary tale, a stark reminder that the monsters we sometimes fear are only in storybooks can, under the right combination of neglect, mental illness, and twisted charisma, take on a very human form. Imagine having a winning personality so compelling it earns you a spot on a nationally televised dating show, all while you're secretly one of the most prolific and sadistic serial killers in American history. This is the bone-chilling reality of Rodney Alcala, a man whose intelligence, charm, and good looks were the perfect weapons in a decades-long campaign of terror. A man who danced in the spotlight on the dating game even as the bodies of his victims piled up in the shadows. His story is a masterclass in deception, a terrifying example of how a monstrous predator can hide behind a facade of normalcy and even celebrity. Alcala's public persona was that of a Renaissance man. He was a talented photographer who attended UCLA and New York University, even studying under the famed filmmaker Roman Polanski. He was handsome, well-spoken, and intellectually engaging. He used all of these attributes as bait. His preferred method for luring victims was to approach young women and teenage girls, offering to take their photographs for a portfolio or an art project. He presented himself as a legitimate artist, and many were flattered by the attention from such a charismatic and seemingly professional man. This ruse gave him the perfect excuse to get them alone, often in isolated areas where he would then assault and murder them. His crimes were marked by extreme violence and a signature of tying ligatures around his victims' necks, often tightening and loosening them to prolong the torture. He was a true sadist who enjoyed the control and the suffering he inflicted. The sheer audacity of his double life reached its peak in 1978. By this time, Alcala was already a suspect in the murders of several women in California and New York, though he had not yet been charged. Incredibly, he auditioned for and was selected as a bachelor on the popular ABC television show The Dating Game. The episode is surreal to watch today. Bachelor number 1, introduced as a successful photographer, was Alcala. He appeared alongside 2 other normal, jovial bachelors. From the moment he began answering the bachelorette's questions, he stood out, but not in a good way. His responses were bizarre, creepy, and off-putting. He described his ideal date in a nightclub where the lights are blinking and people are swaying to the music, all delivered with a strange, unnerving cadence. The bachelorette, a woman named Cheryl Bradshaw, was visibly uncomfortable. When she ultimately selected him as the winner, she reportedly had such a bad feeling about him that she refused to go on the chaperoned date to Magic Mountain that she had won. Her intuition may very well have saved her life. The idea that a network television show was minutes away from sending an unsuspecting woman on a date with an active serial killer is a horror story in itself, a moment where reality TV and true crime collided in the most grotesque way imaginable. Alcala's ability to evade justice for so long was a frustrating testament to both his intelligence and the limitations of pre-digital police work. He was arrested multiple times over the years. In 1971, he was actually convicted of the assault and attempted murder of an 8-year-old girl, but he served less than 3 years in prison before being paroled. In 1979, he was arrested for the murder of a 12-year-old girl named Robin Samso, a case that would become central to his eventual prosecution. He was tried twice for her murder. The first conviction was overturned on appeal. It was during the long, drawn-out legal process for this case that investigators began to slowly unravel the full, horrifying scope of his crimes. The real breakthrough came decades later in the 2000s with advances in forensic technology and a renewed determination by law enforcement. Orange County investigators launched Operation Green River, a systematic review of all the evidence in Alcala's possession. They discovered a trove of over 1,000 photographs he had taken, many of which appeared to be of his victims both before and after their deaths. The district attorney's office released these photos to the public, asking for help in identifying the women and girls in them. This effort, combined with DNA evidence and painstaking detective work, finally allowed them to connect Alcala to a string of cold case murders across California, New York, and Wyoming. In 2010, he was finally convicted of 5 murders and sentenced to death. But authorities firmly believe his true victim count is far, far higher, potentially up to 130 people, which would make him one of the most prolific serial killers in U.S. history. Rodney Alcala died in prison of natural causes in 2021, taking the full truth of his atrocities to the grave. His legacy is a haunting reminder that the most dangerous monsters aren't the ones who lurk in dark alleys. They're the ones who know exactly how to smile for the camera. While the case of Rodney Alcala revealed a killer who hid in the glare of the public eye, our next story is one of pure, chilling anonymity, a grim series of discoveries that haunted New York City for years with a terrifying question: who was discarding human bodies like common trash? This is the unsettling mystery of the garbage bag killer, a phantom who used the urban landscape itself as his dumping ground, leaving behind a trail of death wrapped in plastic. The first discovery that signaled a pattern came in the summer of 1988. On June 28th, a woman's torso was found stuffed inside a black plastic bag, discarded on the side of the Sheridan Expressway in the Bronx. Just over a month later, on August 5th, another black plastic bag was found, this one containing the remains of a different woman, left near the Pelham Parkway. The city's medical examiner determined that both women had been strangled. The use of identical, common trash bags and the similar manner of disposal suggested a horrifying possibility: a single, methodical killer was at work. But with no heads, hands, or feet recovered, identifying the victims and finding any link between them was nearly impossible. They were Jane Doe's, their stories and their identities erased by the killer's brutality. The pattern continued and the toll grew. Over the next several years, more black plastic bags containing dismembered bodies were discovered in public spaces across the city, along roadsides, in weed-strewn vacant lots, and near parks. The killer's signature was as consistent as it was callous. He would meticulously dismember his victims, discard their remains in those ubiquitous black bags, and then casually deposit them in locations where they were sure to be found, yet where he could remain utterly invisible. He wasn't hiding his crimes, he was displaying them, treating human beings as literal garbage to be taken out and left on the curb. The media, gripped by the macabre and depersonalized nature of the crimes, quickly coined the moniker that would stick: the garbage bag killer. For detectives, the case was a nightmare of dead ends. Without fingerprints or dental records from the severed hands and heads, identifying the victims was a monumental task. Without witnesses or any forensic evidence beyond the bodies themselves, finding a suspect seemed impossible. The killer was a ghost, his victims were ghosts, and the investigation stalled, leaving a cloud of fear and frustration over the city. The critical break in the case came not from a witness or a confession, but from the quiet, painstaking work of forensic science. In the mid-1990s, a determined detective and an innovative medical examiner decided to re-examine the cases using a then novel technique: mitochondrial DNA testing. This type of DNA analysis is particularly useful for degraded samples, as it can be extracted from bones, hair, and teeth, which is exactly what they had. By testing the remains of the various victims, they were able to achieve a stunning breakthrough. They conclusively linked the murders of at least 4 women through DNA evidence, proving definitively that a single serial killer was responsible. This was a monumental step, finally confirming what investigators had long suspected, but the victory was bittersweet. While they now knew one man had killed these women, they still had no idea who he was. The DNA profile they developed did not match any offender in the growing state or national databases. Even with this scientific proof, the killer's identity remained, and still remains, one of New York City's most infuriating cold cases. The victims, through determined investigative work, were eventually given back their names. They were identified as 35-year-old Yvette Washington, 25-year-old Annette Green, 28-year-old Tawana Edwards, and 31-year-old Valerie Weeks. They were women who had struggled with addiction and sometimes worked in the sex trade, making them devastatingly vulnerable targets for a predator who knew they were less likely to be immediately missed and that their disappearances might not prompt an urgent police response. This tragic reality is a recurring and painful theme in the annals of serial murder, where society's most marginalized individuals so often become prey. The story of the garbage bag killer is a haunting paradox of modern criminology. It is a case where science triumphed in one sense, brilliantly connecting a series of horrific crimes and giving names to the voiceless victims. Yet, it also stands as a stark reminder that a DNA profile is not a name and an address. Without a match, it is simply a unique code for a ghost. The killer, whoever he was, exploited the anonymity of the big city and the fragility of his victims' lives. He operated with a chilling efficiency and confidence, believing he would never be caught, and so far he has been right. His DNA exists in a database, a silent digital warrant waiting for the day he is arrested for another crime, or a relative submits their DNA to a genealogy website and the system finally pings with a match. Until that day, the case remains open, a grim testament to a monster who vanished into the city he used as his personal graveyard. Perhaps no case better illustrates the terrifying immediacy with which violence can be broadcast into our lives than the shocking events of Easter Sunday, 2017, in Cleveland, Ohio. That afternoon, a 74-year-old man named Robert Godwin Sr. was taking a leisurely walk home after having dinner with his family. He was carrying a plastic bag containing a few cans of aluminum he had collected for recycling, a simple, peaceful act on a quiet street. At the same time, 37-year-old Steve Stevens, a behavioral health aide, was driving around the city in his white Ford Fusion, his mind consumed by a vortex of personal demons. He was deeply in debt, convinced his life was falling apart, and blaming his longtime girlfriend and his mother for his problems. In a moment of unfathomable darkness, he decided to randomly target a stranger, later telling a friend over the phone that he was going to find someone to kill. He spotted Mr. Godwin, rolled down his window, and asked him to repeat the name of his girlfriend. Confused but polite, the elderly man said the name. Steve Stevens then raised a handgun and shot Robert Godwin Sr. in the head at point-blank range, murdering him in cold blood on the sidewalk. The act itself was horrifying enough, but what happened next catapulted the crime into a new and disturbing dimension of the digital age. Stevens didn't flee the scene. He took out his smartphone, opened the Facebook app, and began recording a video. In a chillingly calm monologue, he spoke directly to the camera, identifying himself and claiming he had just killed 13 people and was looking for more. He then panned the camera down to show the lifeless body of Robert Godwin on the pavement behind his car. He uploaded this graphic video directly to his public Facebook profile. For hours, the video remained active on the platform, spreading virally as horrified users shared it, reported it, and commented on it in a state of collective shock and disbelief. The murder of a complete stranger had been transformed into a piece of shareable content, a snuff film broadcast on one of the world's largest social networks. The video instantly triggered a massive multi-state manhunt. Stevens continued his rampage, using Facebook Live to broadcast additional videos as he drove, taunting the police and threatening more violence. He claimed he was on a killing spree, though authorities would later determine Mr. Godwin was his only victim. For 2 days, he evaded capture, his digital footprint and real-world movements creating a terrifying, real-time crime drama that played out on news channels and social media feeds across the country. The manhunt finally ended in Erie, Pennsylvania, when a fast food employee recognized Stevens' car in a parking lot and called the police. As officers moved in to apprehend him, Stevens took his own life with a single gunshot, ending the chase but leaving behind a legacy of trauma and a barrage of difficult questions about the responsibilities of technology platforms. The case of the Facebook killer became a watershed moment, forcing a painful and urgent reckoning for social media companies. The central, agonizing question was how such a graphically violent video could be uploaded and remain visible for so long. Facebook's content moderation systems, which at the time relied heavily on user reports rather than proactive artificial intelligence scanning, had catastrophically failed. The company faced a firestorm of criticism for its inability to swiftly contain the viral violence. prompting a major overhaul of its live streaming policies and a massive investment in technology and human moderators to better detect and remove extremist content in real time. Beyond the technical failure, the case exposed the horrifying new reality that these platforms could be weaponized by disturbed individuals not just to document crime, but to achieve a perverse form of instant global infamy. Steve Stevens wasn't just committing a murder, he was directing, producing, and starring in his own personal horror film, using the tools of social connection to deliver a message of pure hate and nihilism to a captive audience of millions. His actions forced us all to confront a dark paradox of our connected world. The same technology that allows us to share life's greatest joys can also, in the blink of an eye, be used to force us to witness its most unimaginable evils. But the most surreal and unsettling criminal fronts often hide in the very fabric of American nostalgia, wrapping their illicit goods in the cheerful, innocent packaging of a cherished childhood memory. This brings us to a scheme so audacious it sounds like a rejected plotline from a dark crime drama. The ice cream truck drug ring, an operation that turned the iconic jingle of the neighborhood ice cream man into a secret signal for something far more sinister than a bomb pop or a choco taco. For years, across multiple states including Ohio, Kentucky, and Indiana, a specific fleet of ice cream trucks operated with a dual inventory. By day, they were a familiar sight, cruising suburban streets and parking lots, serving up frozen novelties to eager children. The drivers were friendly, the music was catchy, and the business appeared completely legitimate. But for a select clientele, often adults who would approach the truck without any children in tow, the menu had a secret second page. Alongside the push pops and snow cones, these vendors were also discreetly selling large quantities of cocaine, heroin, and prescription painkillers. The operation was a masterpiece of camouflage. The constant flow of legitimate, cash-based ice cream sales provided the perfect cover for laundering their drug money. The incessant, looping jingle masked quiet conversations about weight and price, and the mobile nature of the business meant they could service a vast network of buyers across city and even state lines, all while appearing to be nothing more than entrepreneurs chasing the soft-serve dream. The scheme began to unravel not due to a single mistake, but through the persistent multi-agency work of law enforcement who noticed a pattern that didn't add up. Why were certain ice cream trucks making repeated stops at known drug houses, often for extended periods without any children approaching? How were these businesses turning such an enormous profit when their primary product was a $2 ice cream sandwich? An investigation dubbed Operation Cone A was launched, involving local police, sheriff's departments, and the Drug Enforcement Administration. Agents conducted surveillance, used confidential informants, and even made undercover purchases, documenting how the transaction would work. An adult would approach the window, order a specific ice cream item as a code, and then ask for something extra or the special sauce. The driver would then retrieve the drugs from a hidden compartment, often built into the freezing unit itself, and the exchange would be made, the illegal goods handed over in a napkin or tucked inside the wrapper of a frozen treat. The bust, when it finally came, was a massive coordinated effort. In a single day, law enforcement executed over 24 search warrants, raiding homes, warehouses, and of course, the ice cream trucks themselves. They seized millions of dollars in cash, vehicles, and large stashes of narcotics. The takedown exposed a sophisticated and highly organized ring that had been operating for nearly a decade, its leaders using the wholesome image of the ice cream business to build a multi-state drug empire. The public reaction was a mixture of shock, anger, and a profound sense of violation. The ice cream truck is a symbol of summer, of community, of simple childhood joy. To discover it had been weaponized as a delivery system for addiction and despair felt like a deep betrayal of a national trust. The case forced communities to re-examine a beloved institution, a dark reminder that the most effective disguise is often the one we would never think to question. And just when you thought the most dangerous thing in your medicine cabinet was an expired prescription, a case emerged from the heart of Chicago that shattered the very notion of consumer safety, turning a trusted household name into an instrument of terror. In the autumn of 1982, a quiet, creeping panic began to spread, not from a shadowy alley or a violent crime spree, but from the most mundane of places, the family medicine shelf. It started on the morning of September 29th, when a 12-year-old girl from the Chicago suburb of Elk Grove Village named Mary Kellerman complained of a stuffy nose and a sore throat. Her parents gave her one extra-strength Tylenol capsule. Within hours, she was dead. That same day, just a few miles away in Arlington Heights, a 27-year-old postal worker named Adam Janus died suddenly at his home. Grieving family members gathered at his house to console each other. In their distress, his brother Stanley and his brother's wife, Teresa, both took Tylenol from the same bottle Adam had used. Within days, they were both dead too. The pattern was as inexplicable as it was horrifying. Over the next 48 hours, 3 more victims, Mary McFarland, Paula Prince, and Mary Riener, all died under similar, sudden circumstances. The only common thread, investigators soon discovered, was that each victim had taken an extra-strength Tylenol capsule shortly before collapsing. The discovery that followed sent a shockwave of pure dread across the entire nation. Chemists analyzing the tablets from the recovered bottles made a finding so sinister it was almost impossible to comprehend. Someone had methodically opened the capsules, removed the acetaminophen powder, replaced it with a lethal dose of potassium cyanide, and then resealed the bottles and placed them back on the shelves of various grocery and drug stores. This was not a manufacturing error or an industrial accident. This was a deliberate, calculated act of murder, a form of terrorism that invaded the most private of spaces, the home, and weaponized a symbol of health and relief. The immediate response was a public health emergency of unprecedented scale. Johnson & Johnson, the parent company of Tylenol's maker McNeil Consumer Products, took the extraordinary step of issuing a nationwide recall, pulling 31 million bottles of Tylenol from store shelves at a staggering cost of over $100 million. They also took out full-page ads in major newspapers, warning the public not to consume any of their products. In Chicago, officials used emergency broadcast systems to warn people, a move typically reserved for severe weather or national disasters. The fear was absolutely paralyzing. People across the country emptied their medicine cabinets, throwing away not just Tylenol but any over-the-counter medication in a capsule, terrified that they might be next. Copycat crimes began to pop up in other states, with products like Lipton soup and eye drops being tampered with, though none resulted in deaths. For the first time, America was collectively holding its breath, afraid of its own medicine. The investigation into the Tylenol murders was one of the largest and most complex in FBI history, involving hundreds of agents chasing down tens of thousands of leads. A prime suspect quickly emerged, a man named James William Lewis. After the murders, Lewis had sent a bizarre extortion letter to Johnson & Johnson, demanding $1 million to stop the killing. He was quickly tracked down and arrested in New York City. While he had a history of fraud and had used the alias James Richardson, the same name used to send the letter, there was a critical problem for prosecutors. They could find no direct physical evidence linking him to the actual tampering of the bottles. He was convicted of extortion and served 12 years in prison, but he was never charged with the murders themselves. He always maintained his innocence regarding the poisonings, claiming the letter was just a poorly conceived attempt to exploit the tragedy for money. Over the decades, numerous other suspects were scrutinized and ultimately cleared. The case grew cold, a frustrating and haunting open wound for the victims' families and the investigators who had worked tirelessly to solve it. Yet from this unimaginable tragedy arose one of the most significant and lasting advancements in consumer product safety the world has ever seen. The sheer terror of the Tylenol case created an immediate and powerful demand for change. Within months of the murders, and largely due to intense pressure from Johnson & Johnson, the United States Congress passed the Federal Anti-Tampering Act in 1983, making it a federal crime to tamper with consumer products. More visibly, the entire industry revolutionized its packaging. The familiar safety seals we now take for granted, the foil wrappers under the cap, the plastic bands around the lid, the impossible-to-open clamshell containers were all a direct result of the Chicago poisonings. Johnson & Johnson, in a move that is still taught in business schools as a masterclass in crisis management, led the charge. They reintroduced Tylenol in a new, triple-sealed, tamper-resistant package and offered massive coupons to win back the public's trust. Their swift, transparent, and consumer-focused response is credited with saving the brand from oblivion. The Tylenol murders remain officially unsolved, a chilling whodunit with no satisfying conclusion. But the legacy of those 7 victims is etched into the safety seals on every bottle of medicine, every jar of peanut butter, and every bottle of soda we open, a silent, daily reminder of a week of terror that forever changed how we trust the products we bring into our homes. For over a decade, the disappearance of Tara Grinstead was the haunting, unsolved mystery that gripped the entire state of Georgia. A beloved high school history teacher and former beauty queen in the small, close-knit community of Ocilla, Tara was the kind of person everyone knew and admired. At 30 years old, she was vibrant, deeply involved in her community, and seemed to have a life filled with promise. Then, on October 22, 2005, she simply vanished. Her family reported her missing after she failed to show up to teach her classes at Irwin County High School, an absence that was immediately alarming to everyone who knew her meticulous nature. When police arrived at her home, they found her car in the driveway, her purse inside, and nothing out of place except a single, faintly glowing ember in her fireplace, the only clue in a home that showed no signs of a struggle. It was as if she had been plucked from existence, leaving behind a void of silence and 1,000 unanswered questions. The investigation that followed was massive but ultimately fruitless. The Georgia Bureau of Investigation pursued thousands of leads, conducted countless interviews, and excavated areas based on tips, but each path led to a dead end. The case grew cold, but it was never forgotten. In a town like Ocilla, the shadow of Tara's absence lingered over every homecoming parade, every graduation ceremony, and every anniversary of that October day. For 11 long years, her family, her students, and an entire community lived with the agonizing uncertainty of not knowing what had happened to the woman they loved. The mystery of Tara Grinstead became a true crime legend, the subject of podcasts and online forums, a puzzle that seemed destined to remain forever unsolved. Then, in 2017, a stunning break in the case emerged from the most unlikely of sources. A secret confession, a tangled web of teenage obsession, and a long-buried secret that would shatter the peaceful facade of the small town. The truth finally surfaced thanks to a determined private investigator and a popular podcast called Up and Vanished, which reinvestigated the case and brought renewed national attention to the mystery. This renewed scrutiny seemed to put pressure on individuals who had been holding onto a dark secret for over a decade. The break came when a man named Bo Dukes, a former student of Tara's, confessed to a friend that he had helped burn a body years earlier. That friend, disturbed by the revelation, eventually went to the police. Under questioning, Dukes pointed the finger at his high school friend, Ryan Duke. Ryan, also a former student of Tara Grinstead, was arrested and charged with her murder. In a shocking court hearing, he confessed, telling a story so bizarre and tragic it was difficult to comprehend. According to his confession, on that October night, a drunk and high Ryan Duke had gone to Tara's house to steal money for drugs. He claimed he entered through a window, but Tara woke up and confronted him. In a panic, he said he punched her and accidentally killed her. The story he told was one of a botched burglary that escalated into a catastrophic accident. But as the investigation deepened, a far more complex and sinister motive began to emerge, one that implicated others and suggested the crime was anything but accidental. The plot thickened with the involvement of Bo Dukes, who admitted he helped Ryan Duke dispose of Tara's body by burning it in a pecan orchard owned by his family. The gruesome act was an attempt to erase all evidence of the crime, and for over a decade it had worked, but the most shocking twist was yet to come. As the legal proceedings continued, another figure entered the picture, a woman named Brooke Sheridan, who was Bo Dukes' girlfriend at the time of the murder. Through text messages and testimonies, a new narrative took shape, one not of a random burglary, but of a dangerous love triangle and a potential premeditated act. Reports suggested that Ryan Duke had been infatuated with his former teacher and that Brooke Sheridan, jealous of this obsession, may have pressured him to confront Tara. The theory posited that the murder was not a random act of panic but a planned attack driven by jealousy and manipulation, with Ryan Duke acting at the behest of his friend's girlfriend. This version of events painted a picture of teenage drama curdling into something monstrous, a toxic dynamic that culminated in the death of an innocent woman. The case revealed a devastating portrait of a community's idol brought down by the hidden turmoil of those who admired her from afar, a tragedy where the classroom bonds of a small town became the very threads that unraveled into a nightmare. While many criminals seek to leave a bold signature, the most successful ones often strive for utter anonymity, perfecting a method so simple and unremarkable that it renders them practically invisible. This was the chilling expertise of a man who terrorized homeowners across multiple states, not with violence, but with a silent, ghost-like precision that earned him a moniker straight out of a bizarre nightmare, the Pillowcase Bandit. For nearly a decade, from the mid-2000s into the early 2010s, this phantom operated across Florida, North Carolina, and Virginia, invading the sanctity of hundreds of homes. His pattern was always the same, a carefully rehearsed ritual of violation. He would target upscale suburban neighborhoods during the daytime hours when residents were most likely to be at work or school. He favored homes that backed onto wooded areas or golf courses, giving him ample cover for his approach and escape. Gaining entry was his first act of quiet genius. He was a master at bypassing alarms and picking locks, often leaving no sign of forced entry whatsoever. Once inside, his work began. His tool of choice was not a weapon, but an object of pure domesticity, a pillowcase snatched directly from the very bed in the home he was robbing. This was a crucial part of his method. By using items already inside the residence, he ensured he brought no foreign fibers or trace evidence with him. He would then move from room to room with a cold, efficient calm, filling the pillowcase with high-value, easily portable items, jewelry, cash, watches, and small electronics. He was discerning, taking only what he could quickly liquidate. The entire process would often take less than 10 minutes. Then he would simply vanish, leaving behind a home that felt exactly as the owners had left it, with the only sign of his presence being the terrifying absence of their most valued possessions and the eerie detail of a missing pillowcase. For the victims, the psychological impact was profound. This wasn't a messy, violent ransacking. It was a clean, calculated violation that made them feel watched, studied, and utterly vulnerable in a place they had once considered safe. The investigation was a monumental challenge for law enforcement across multiple jurisdictions. They were chasing a ghost who left no fingerprints, no DNA, and no discernible pattern beyond his preferred item for carrying loot. There were no witnesses, no vehicle descriptions, and no spikes in pawn shop activity linked to the stolen goods, indicating he had a sophisticated fencing operation. For years, the case files grew thicker, filled with frustrated notes and dead ends. The break that every detective prays for finally came from the most unlikely of places. The one piece of evidence the bandit believed was untraceable, the pillowcase itself. Following a 2011 burglary in a home in Wake Forest, North Carolina, forensics officers, almost as a last resort, decided to submit the lone pillowcase left at the scene for advanced testing. This was not a standard practice, as the cloth was not believed to be a viable surface for evidence, but this time technology caught up with the criminal. Using a technique called touch DNA analysis, which can recover genetic material from minute skin cells left behind when an object is handled, technicians made a stunning discovery. They found a partial DNA profile on the pillowcase that did not belong to the homeowners. This profile was entered into the National DNA database known as CODIS, and to the investigators' amazement, it produced a hit. The DNA matched a man named Robert Jason Douthit, a 44-year-old from Greensboro, North Carolina. Douth, it was not unknown to police. He had a prior criminal record for breaking and entering, and his DNA was already in the system from a previous conviction. The elusive pillowcase bandit finally had a name and a face. Investigators from multiple agencies quickly coordinated, building an irrefutable case by linking his DNA to numerous other burglaries across state lines. He was arrested in 2014, bringing an end to his nearly decade-long spree, which authorities believe may have included over 200 break-ins. In the end, the pillowcase bandit's greatest asset, his silent, untraceable method, became his ultimate undoing, proving that even the most careful ghost can be brought to justice by the relentless march of forensic science. Most tales of sudden fortune begin with a dream coming true, but for Yoruj Khan, a hardworking dry cleaner from Chicago, his $1 million win was the opening act of an unimaginable nightmare. In June 2012, he scraped together a few dollars to buy an instant scratch-off lottery ticket, a small indulgence in an otherwise disciplined life. To his absolute astonishment, he won, not a few hundred or a few thousand, but $1 million. A video from the Lottery Commission captured his pure, unadulterated joy as he posed with a giant check, his face beaming with a smile that spoke of relief and a brighter future for his family. He planned to pay off his debts, invest in his business, and take his loved ones on a pilgrimage to Mecca. It was a classic immigrant success story, a moment of beautiful, deserved luck. Weeks later, after deciding to take the lump sum payout of just over $400,000 after taxes, he went to bed a happy man. He never woke up. The following morning, his wife found him unresponsive. His death was as sudden as his windfall, and the Cook County Medical Examiner's Office, after a routine examination finding no signs of trauma, initially ruled he had died of natural causes, likely hardening of the arteries. Yoruj Khan was buried, and his tragic story seemed to be a simple, heartbreaking case of a man who never got to enjoy his reward. But a single, anonymous phone call to the Chicago Police Department would unravel that simple narrative and expose a plot of Shakespearean betrayal. A relative whose identity has never been publicly revealed expressed deep suspicion about the circumstances of Khan's death. They urged investigators to take a closer look, prompting the medical examiner to reopen the case. This time, they ordered comprehensive toxicology tests. The results, which came back weeks later, were so shocking they read like something from an Agatha Christie novel. Yoruj Khan had not died from natural causes. His system contained a lethal quantity of cyanide, a deadly poison that causes a rapid and agonizing death by suffocating the body's cells. The ruling was swiftly changed from natural causes to homicide. The celebration had officially become a murder investigation, and the $1 million suddenly looked less like a prize and more like a motive. The investigation that followed peeled back the layers of a seemingly ordinary family to reveal a web of jealousy, greed, and bitter rivalries. The prime suspects were inevitably those closest to him, the very people who would benefit from his sudden fortune. Under the intense glare of the police spotlight, his family structure revealed its fractures. There was his wife, Shabana Ansari, who stood to inherit the entire estate. There was his father-in-law, with whom he shared a home and a business. And then, complicating matters further, there was a previous wife and a teenage daughter from that first marriage, who also had a legal claim to a portion of the money. Each had potential motive and, in some cases, potential access. The drama escalated when Khan's brother came forward, publicly pointing the finger at Ansari and her father, alleging a toxic home environment and a rushed burial against his family's wishes. The case became a media sensation, a real-time whodunit where every development was dissected on the nightly news. Yet, for all the public suspicion and forensic certainty that a murder had occurred, the Cook County State's Attorney's Office faced a towering challenge, building a case without a single eyewitness and with circumstantial evidence that was compelling but not conclusive. Who purchased the cyanide, a substance not easily obtained? How was it administered? The answers to these questions remained locked away, and despite years of investigation, no charges were ever filed. The case officially remains open but cold, a frustrating and tragic puzzle with all the pieces except the one that reveals the killer's face. The story of Yoruj Khan is a chilling modern fable about the corrupting power of greed, a stark reminder that a sudden fortune can sometimes be a curse in disguise, tearing apart the very bonds it should have strengthened and leaving behind a legacy of mystery where there should have been one of joy. And so, we reach the end of our journey through the looking glass of American crime, a tour through 32 stories so peculiar they defy belief. From a man leaping into legend with a bag of cash to a teenager whose laughter masked a profound cry for help, from a predator hiding behind a camera to a killer who packaged his victims like trash. Each one of these tales, in its own strange way, serves as a powerful reminder that the human capacity for the bizarre is truly limitless. We often look to fiction for our most shocking plot twists and unbelievable characters, but as these cases prove, reality doesn't just compete with fiction. It often wins hands down in the contest for the utterly surreal. These stories show us that crime is rarely a simple equation of good versus evil. It's a vast, chaotic spectrum of motive, method, and madness, where ambition curdles into obsession, desperation morphs into invention, and sometimes the most unassuming face can hide the most monstrous secret. They challenge our assumptions, confirm our deepest fears about human nature, and occasionally, against all odds, make us laugh at the sheer absurdity of it all. This incredible diversity of strange, sad, and shocking behavior is a testament to the fact that truth will always be not just stranger than fiction, but infinitely more creative. So now we turn it over to you. Did we miss one of your favorite unbelievable crime stories? Is there a local legend from your town, a case you followed for years, or a bizarre heist that you still can't wrap your head around? Share your own picks for the weirdest true crime tales down in the comments below. We'd love to hear them. And if you've enjoyed this dive into the strange and unbelievable, make sure to subscribe and hit that notification bell, because we're just getting started uncovering the most bizarre facts about America.